Hey guys, imagine you're huddled in a half-collapsed longhouse, the wind howling like an enraged frost giant outside, and your only hope of not becoming an impromptu dinner for wolves is a single ember and a pile of reindeer hides. Sound cozy? Didn't think so, but stick around, because I promise you're about to discover the sheer absurdity of Viking domestic life in a way that'll have you clutching your thermostat remote like it's a Valkyrie's hammer. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Nothing says family bonding quite like arguing over the last scrap of birchwood, while temperatures outside make a refrigerator look like a tropical vacation spot. In the frozen corners of Scandinavia, when the sun dipped below the horizon for weeks or even months on end, warmth wasn't just a luxury. It was the difference between being a living, breathing person and becoming an icicle with a pulse. So how did Viking families, the same ones who raided monasteries with gleeful abandon, manage to keep the frostbite at bay? It wasn't with high-tech blankets or electric heaters, that's for sure. They relied on fire and furs, forging alliances with flickering embers and animal pelts, turning survival into a chaotic dance of heat sharing, storytelling, and occasional bear chasing. Let's start with the centerpiece of every Viking abode, the hearth. Not your average cozy fireplace. You didn't see a single home sweet home sign above these suckers. No, these were primitive stone structures, often little more than a pit in the center of the room, filled with burning logs that smelled like a liquor-soaked bonfire. Smoke curled through a hole in the roof and coated every wall in a patina of soot that would make modern graffiti artists weep with envy. But that was the plan. Each breath you took was tinged with wood smoke, reminding you that survival was 100% optional but highly recommended. Families congregated around this infernal pit as the only source of light, heat, and conversation in an otherwise pitch-black sub-zero nightmare. Even the kids knew better than to poke at the flames too often, lest their fingers become kindling. Now picture an extended household of maybe 10 chattering relatives, plus a handful of knackered thralls. That's Viking for servants, or people who inexplicably owe you favors. Every evening, the clan would jockey for prime seating around the hearth. There was old Sigrid, the matriarch whose feet were perpetually wrapped in 3 pelts and a woolen sock so thick that it could double as a puffer jacket. Next to her would perch young Bjorn, barely 7 winters old but already convinced he could wrestle a troll, or at least a particularly cantankerous goat. Then there was Eric, the teenage son who thought the whole chore was beneath him, preferring to sulk in the shadowy corner, plotting his next raid, or fiddle with his mead mug like it was a Game Boy. It was a delicate balance. If you edged too close to the flames, you risked a charred tunic or an accidental eyebrow at barbecue. Too far, and your toes would promptly detach and wander off to become someone else's hot water bottle. Fur distribution turned into a daily soap opera. Every night, the eldest male would claim the prime spot, nearest to the blaze, ostensibly because he was the provider. But let's be honest, his actual contributions to the firewood stash were questionable. Meanwhile, women and children huddled on the periphery, tightly wrapped in a patchwork of wolf pelts, bear hides, and the occasional sheepskin that had been soiled during last month's ritual pig roast. These weren't the clean, fluffy furs you see in fancy magazine spreads. These were battle-tested skins with claw marks from that one time Ragnar tried to wrestle the family's prize-winning ram. You could smell the faint whiff of blood, dirt, and long-dead creature wafting through the air, mixing with the smoke in a toxic cocktail that was both alarming and strangely comforting. After all, if you weren't coughing up flecks of soot by midnight, were you even Viking? Disagreements flared like embers whenever someone tried to sneak an extra pelt. "You have 2 already, Gunnar," Aunt Freydis would hiss, her breath visible in the icy chill. Gunnar, who likely had been daydreaming about plundering monasteries instead of gathering furs, would grumble that Sigrid's feet were the size of a fjord and needed 2 bear pelts just to keep her ankles from detaching. And so the negotiations began. Trade you 1 wolf pelt for the smaller sheep hide. I'll toss in this slightly damp piece of driftwood. Fine, but only if you stop singing that blasted sea shanty. Which, incidentally, sounded more like a half-starved goose with a sore throat. These barter sessions could last for hours, each side pretending their pelt was the most valuable asset since stolen silver. Of course, it wasn't always purely transactional. There was a strange camaraderie that formed from this nightly cuddle-puddle of the cold and miserable. Stories were exchanged over the crackle of flames, tales of sea serpents, far-off lands, and the one time Grandpa Harold claimed he slayed a dragon, even though everyone knew it was merely a particularly large iguana, imported by a very confused trader. Laughter echoed through the rafters, ringing out like a beacon against the encroaching darkness. For a fleeting moment, the freezing cold outside seemed irrelevant, a distant threat held at bay by hearth and hide. In these moments, the Viking family looked less like frostbitten wanderers, and more like a tight-knit sitcom cast, albeit one that occasionally lost an ear to frostbite. Yet, as any student of history will tell you, the moment you get comfortable is the moment the Norse gods send misfortune. Picture this. A sudden gale rattles the longhouse, slamming the door open and extinguishing half the fire. Chaos ensues. Kerosene. Electricity? Nope. Everyone scrambles for fresh wood, but the pile is barely half full, thanks to last week's feast turns forest fire. Panicked shrieks fill the smoky air as the temperature plummets. Aunt Freydis tries to salvage a flaming ember by cupping it in her sooty hands, only to yelp in pain as the searing heat meets her frozen fingertips. Meanwhile, Eric finally emerges from his sulk, wielding a crude, and shockingly effective, set of tongs made from blacksmith scraps. He scoops the ember into a metal pot, hoping to preserve its life like some kind of flame biologist, while Bjorn tosses in a handful of birch bark, which crackles back to life like a wounded animal. In the aftermath, everyone gathers closer, as though physically fusing their bodies will generate more heat. A makeshift shift system emerges. The strongest youth must venture outside shortly to fetch more driftwood or hack at tree stumps, while the elderly and infirm reign supreme in the warmth, hosting impromptu regattas of thumb wrestling to decide who gets the next lap of furs. It's a ritualized gamble. Win and you bask in glory and heat. Lose and you embrace the icy shoulder of your own family member. Miraculously, these deranged competitions often end in laughter, camaraderie renewed, and the burning realization that perhaps human connection is the ultimate source of warmth. But winter nights are long, and the supply of stories is finite. Soon enough, talk shifts from mythical creatures to practical tips. How to fashion a crude bed frame that hangs your hide just above the dank floor, letting the smoke from the hearth rise and simmer beneath you like a cold sauna. Or how to turn a cow's bladder into a primitive insulating bladder, an innovation that sounds like mad science, but, to the Viking mind, was as natural as breathing. These were the legends of their people. Ingenuity born of desperation, each hack more absurd than the last, yet astonishingly effective. After all, when your choices are invent an inflatable animal organ or become an ice sculpture, the bar for creative survival drops to goosebump-inducing extremes. As the first light of dawn creeps through that smoky ceiling vent, families would stretch and yawn, realizing that they had survived another night in what we'd now call Siberia's decorative cousin. They'd emerge from the haze, bloodshot eyes searching for a new fire-starting ritual, because the embers from last night were as useful as a wet matchstick. And so, the cycle continued. Gather wood, barter furs, tell wild tales, nearly freeze, innovate like mad scientists, and laugh through the madness. It's a grisly, glorious dance that defined Viking family life, survival sculpted from cold air and heated disputes, bound together by smoke-stained blankets and the burning need to stay alive. The gray dawn barely pierced the smoky haze as the clan stirred from their soot-streaked slumber. No good morning here, just a collective groan as frostbite-tipped elbows nudged neighbors for more blanket, and Aunt Freydis muttered something about Ragnar's snoring being louder than an avalanche. But breakfast waits for no one, not even Vikings who would rather sleep through Ragnarok than face the chill. Part of surviving winter was mastering the art of multi-use embers. Take last night's hearth. Once the main fire dwindled to a bed of glowing coals, the family harvested them into portable ember pots, hollowed-out clay jars wrapped in moss and straw. These ember pots were then strategically placed beneath sleeping hides, turning each makeshift bed into a mini Bathurst furnace. In theory, you'd wake up to a toasty butt. In practice, half the clan woke to steaming blankets and the other half to blankets so cold that thawing them required a torch and a heartfelt apology. Nevertheless, Everyone agreed it was worth the gamble. After crawling out from under layers of reindeer pelts, breakfast negotiations began in earnest. Food stores by midwinter had the nutritional diversity of a cardboard box, dried fish that could double as boat cleats, lumps of hardtack that broke teeth on contact, and whatever soup the cook could concoct by boiling the driest scraps of meat in icy water. Yet there was a twisted efficiency in austerity. Every crumb tasted like manna, or at least like something edible and possibly not poison. The main topic at the meager table? How to resurrect last season's salted herring into something that didn't resemble a salt lick. Old Sigrid, still wrestling her 3-pelt sock, proposed an ingenious method. Soak the herring overnight in lukewarm birch sap water, then smoke it over juniper branches. This would, she promised, mask both the fish's floor tile consistency and its lingering taste of formaldehyde. Skeptics abounded, particularly the thralls, whose job description now included culinary guinea pig. But hunger trumped caution. By midday, a charred, aromatic herring arrived at the table, steamed to a slightly less lethal softness. Toasting was obligatory. A single morsel required at least 3 hearty skal proclamations to fend off the ghost of anachronistic salmonella. Once the last of the fish was swallowed, amid coughs, hacks, and one dramatic gag from Bjorn, the clan turned to daily chores that doubled as extreme sports. Felling trees in snow-crusted forests was basically an invitation for frost giants to drop pine cones on your head. Every log required wielding an axe that weighed approximately as much as a small warship. Muscles screamed for mercy, but woodpile quotas were non-negotiable. Theft by neighbor clans was very real. Nothing said Viking hospitality, like telling a rival settlement to help themselves to your reserved wood stash. Trading firewood became a high-stakes game of subterfuge. Clans would erect decoy log piles, wood bleached white by sun exposure, useless for burning, but still heavy enough to be convincing. Meanwhile, the genuine pile, tucked behind a curtain of birch bark and half buried under an unassuming mound of snow, remained safe until needed. On more desperate nights, entire families would fan out in the pre-dawn dark, sneaking into neighboring yards to swipe logs, all while trying not to awaken the resident mastiffs, usually descendants of bear hunting spoils. Back at the longhouse, major decisions about fur allocation took center stage. This wasn't just grabbing the fluffiest pelt. It involved mathematical calculations better suited for a runic abacus. Who'd had their turn by the hearth? Who'd just returned from woodcutting duty looking like a human popsicle? Each household mapped out a fur fairness chart, etched crudely into wooden boards with charcoal. Lines indicated who owned which pelt, who owed a temporary loan, and who had defaulted on the last week's goat hide swap. Of course, goats being notoriously slippery in value, some families preferred the stability of badger fur, denser, less prone to mildew, and perfect for tamping into door cracks. Speaking of door cracks, sealing drafty gaps was a never-ending saga. Women and children spent hours stuffing moss, straw, sometimes even offcuts of furs, into the seams between planks. The result? A longhouse so airtight that smoke clearance became a strategic challenge. Hence the trademark smoky ambiance and irrepressible need for a hole poker to clear the roof vent every few hours. This intrusion prevented the occasional asphyxiation, though not the frequent argument over who held the duty of vent policing. Eric, perpetually half asleep, was often assigned the chore, resulting in misfires like poking too vigorously and letting daylight crash in like a royal court jester. To break the monotony and stave off cabin fever, an affliction that made people hallucinate dancing trolls, families organized midwinter gatherings. Imagine a house party where the main event is seeing who can hurl a frozen salmon the farthest. Prizes included extra blankets, maybe a prize pheasant feather for the hat, and shameless bragging rights until the next full moon. Grandpa Harold's legendary fish toss of 6 yards was still the stuff of legend, primarily because few believed he wasn't juicing the fish with willow bark stimulants. Meanwhile, Freitas's thumb wrestling tournament ended when someone smashed the table and discovered a gold ring in the wood, kicking off debates over whether it was loot from a distant raid or a gift from a god with questionable jewelry standards. But not all midwinter festivities were slapstick fun. Yule blots, the pagan feasts honoring the old gods, offered a more ritualistic reprieve from the cold. Families sacrificed their smallest livestock to the gods, praying that the Norse pantheon would dispatch milder weather, or at least ensure the hearth gods didn't up and abandon their domicile. In return, participants sprawled around the hearth in a booze-fueled stupor, chanting verses that sounded like drunk poetry readings. The end result? A communal hangover worsened by low temperatures, and the odd missing chicken attributed to a deity's mid-blot snack. Meanwhile, neighbor alliances formed over shared snowbound crises. Villages would pool wood piles in a great fire brigade, complete with rotating fire watch schedules. This multilateral pact guaranteed that no single longhouse would be left quivering in the cold if their own stash ran low. In exchange, each home dutifully paid its wood tax, which could be a whole log or a handful of dried berries. The logic? Berries were easy to store and carried some dietary value. The result? Berry shortages by spring and frantic foraging expeditions once the snow melted. As winter stretched on, innovation reached fever pitch. One child genius, let's call her Ingrid, because every clan has that one genius, tinkered with a crude fur furnace. She layered hides inside a hollowed-out shaft and lit fires beneath it, forcing hot air to circulate through the pelts before exiting, through small vents at the top. It worked, mostly. The furnace generated pockets of warmth, but also smoke-lensed corridors that made the longhouse resemble a haunted cathedral. Parents grumbled about lighting fires indoors without permission, but conceded that the comedic effect of Eric coughing up soot was worth the minor loss of oxygen. Of course, no technology was foolproof. One week, the furnace backfired spectacularly, sending a volley of embers through the tented ceiling lining. The resulting inferno was less controlled burn and more instant barbecue. Suddenly, half the family was executed from the longhouse with screaming banshee speed, while the other half tripped over thralls carrying buckets of snow for impromptu fire extinguishing. When the smoke finally cleared, everyone stood outside panting, clutching their pelts, looking like survivors of the world's smallest volcanic eruption. Through all this chaos, familial bonds deepened. Nothing cements relationships like mutual near-death by smoke inhalation, frostbite, or stale herring poisoning. Disputes that erupted over bed placement or ration. Shares gave way to camaraderie forged in midnight shoveling of snow from the roof, or joint expeditions to repair the sagging walls that threatened to cave in under the weight of drifts. Mothers whispered advice on layering tunics, fathers bragged about crafting polar-resistant shields, and children swapped tales of phantom wolves sniffing at the door, each story more absurd than the last. By the time the night watch finally ended, marked by the first glimmer of pale pink on the horizon, the surviving clansfolk were a motley crew of soot-faced philosophers, huddled tight to squeeze out every last degree of communal body heat. They had exchanged furs, traded embers, negotiated goat sacrifices, built draft blockers, invented crude heating contraptions, competed in fish-flinging sports, celebrated dubious rituals, and emerged a smidge warmer than they started. Not exactly the epitome of comfort, but in the grand tapestry of Viking existence, it was a triumph of human ingenuity. And yet, for all their resourcefulness, these families remained at the mercy of the long, bitter winter. Tomorrow would bring another round of ice-chilled chores, more frantic fire starting, and at least 3 more bartering sessions that threatened to end in fisticuffs. But through it all, one truth held firm. Survival in the Viking Age wasn't a solo battle. It was a clan-wide, smoke-filled spectacle of absurdity, sacrifice, and occasional sarcasm. If you could laugh through the cold, if you could stare down frost giants and still crack a grin, then you earned your place by the hearth. The dawn that broke on the 3rd week of midwinter was less a sunrise and more a grudging sigh of pale, gray light across the steely sky. The longhouse, already groaning under 3 feet of snow piled on its roof, offered a degree of shelter that was best described as barely adequate. Hands like frozen shovels wrestled at the door latch, sending a shriek of metal on wood that sounded like a banshee sneezing. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the faint whine of waking stomachs. No one had bothered to ring an alarm bell. Surviving Vikings preferred abrupt awakenings by frost-numbed toes jabbing ribs in protest. Breakfast was a communal affair of highly questionable sustenance. A stew so watery you could see your reflection in it, chunks of herring resurrected yet again, and mysterious lumps of jerky that might once have been elk or simply soggy cardboard. Grandpa Harold declared it the finest broth since the last raid, meaning it was at least tolerable if you ignored the occasional eyeball floating among the bones. Conversations revolved around the eternal question, how do you chew wood shavings until they taste like bread? By mid-morning, a council convened at the hearth. It was time to tackle the crux of the winter crisis, the complete depletion of the main woodpile, plus the discovery that half the reserve logs were actually driftwood drenched in salt water. Excellent for seasoning stews, abysmal for burning. A strike team was assembled, comprised of the strongest youths and the most irritable thralls. Their mission, venture into the frozen bog of dastardly things, a place where every footstep threatened to break through ice into a foot of sludge that smelled like decomposing seaweed. The reward, a cache of bog oak rumored to burn so long and bright that it could toast marshmallows on the dark side of the moon. Clad in layers of mismatched furs, the strike team trudged into the wasteland. Cold bit at the exposed parts of their faces, and even the horses wore multiple pelt coats, looking like they'd raided a fur trader's shop. The bog was treacherous. Some paths held solid ground, others were thin ice carpets over yawning pits. It wasn't unusual to step knee-deep into ice water, then haul yourself out like a reluctant mermaid, shaking off half-frozen clothes with a bellow of frustration. Wolves howled in the distance, though these may have been the wind's taunts rather than real beasts. One unlucky thrall, named Olaf, claimed he spotted a frost giant's footprints, then promptly fell into a hidden pool and emerged with a mouthful of bog slime and a hairdo worthy of a drowned rat. After an epic 2 hours of swearing oaths older than Odin, the team reached the bog oak cluster. The logs lay half buried in muck, their dark wood gleaming with oily sheen. Cutting them free required axes sharpened to razor precision and arms like iron bellows. Chunks of wood flew in every direction, landing with satisfying thuds into a makeshift sledge. A triumphant Olaf managed to sever a particularly stubborn log, only to have it fall backwards into the bog, disappearing like a lost ship beneath the waves. A group effort involving yanking ropes, a cavalry of makeshift hooks, and threats to dispatch the bog's resident water spirits finally retrieved the prize. Triumphant, bleary-eyed, and several frostbitten fingers poor, the party heaved their spoils back to the longhouse. Neighbors cheered as the logs were unloaded. Thus, the woodpile crisis was postponed for another week, and bragging rights were awarded in the form of extra porridge rations. The victor, young Ingrid, whose axe-swinging skills had outmatched all, demanded 2 extra spoonfuls of stewed turnips, because superstition held that turnips were the only suitable rewards for near-death escapades. As midday approached, a new dilemma surfaced. Water. The freshest supply was a nearby stream, but it ran through an ice tunnel that demanded spelunking gear no Viking ever owned. Every water-fetching expedition risked head entrapment between icicles that looked like dripping daggers. One brawl nearly broke out when 2 brothers argued over who should lower the bucket first. The loser would endure the perilous descent, while the winner remained to guard the meager stash of barley flour. Eventually, a compromise was reached. They would alternate turns and sing sea shanties to keep spirits high, until someone's voice cracked mid-chorus and everyone started laughing, reminding them that cold misery is best endured with comic relief. Back at the Longhouse, the Midwinter Feast Committee began preparations for the annual Trial by Smoke, a festival celebrating the hearth god, Logi. Families dug through old supplies to find anything combustible. Birch bark brittle as potato chips, juniper branches scented like a forest perfume, and olive pits from last summer's trade with Mediterranean merchants, expensive but capable of producing the tiniest, hottest embers. These materials were reserved for the grand challenge. Who could keep a tiny ember alive the longest without it dying of neglect or exploding into an uncontrollable blaze? Contestants submitted their ember pets to the judge. Sigurd's hushed miracle of an ember, wrapped in dragonfly wings, apparently believed to ward off moisture. Gunnar's hardened coal nugget claimed to be a piece from a fallen star, and Eric's clay-bound ember pot, a creation of dubious hygiene. The crowd gathered around a cleared patch of floor, where the judge flicked a rune-marked scepter to signal the start. Embers glowed dimly in their vessels, as if sulking under the weight of their participants' expectations. Half the longhouse held its breath. The other half poked at blankets to keep warm. After exactly 90 minutes of tense silence, broken only by the sound of one ember cracking under Eric's enthusiastic prodding, Sigurd's dragonfly wing spark flickered valiantly before succumbing to darkness. The judge pronounced her the winner, awarding her a carved stag's horn full of dried berries. She crowed triumphantly, cradling the horn like a newborn child, while the defeated spat out curses that could peel paint. By dusk, practical matters returned. The restored woodpile was split into 2 tiers, prime blazes for the evening's warmth and reserve smolders for emergencies. Families consulted their logs with the seriousness of generals planning siege defenses. Each log was tagged, rotated, and occasionally rubbed with whale oil to prevent premature decay. This was less about paranoia and more about making every piece of wood feel valued. After all, a log left unused was a log that might sprout legs and walk away under the cover of night. Dinner was a celebration of bog oak's triumphant flame. Sweet-smelling smoke infused porridge with a hint of campfire fragrance, making the mush nearly edible without drowning in mead to wash down the ash. Conversations turned to more ambitious survival tinkering. Ideas ranged from hot stone foot baths to stave-constructed smoke tunnels that could channel heat from one end of the longhouse to the other, like an ancient HVAC system. One drunken thrall sketched a design that resembled a dragon eating its own tail, both ingenious and impossible, prompting half the crowd to propose feng shui wards against rogue embers. Night fell swiftly, crushing any hope of stargazing. The longhouse flickered to life with the roar of freshly stoked fires. Pelts were redistributed. Prime seats again sparked contention, but this time the clan had introduced a token system. Wooden tokens handed out to each member based on chores completed. More tokens equaled closer proximity to the fire. Of course, there were complaints that the tokens were rigged, that the system favored donkey skin merit badges, and that Aunt Freitas had somehow managed to amass enough tokens to smother half the hearth. But challenges were politely silenced with the threat of anonymous token theft, an effective method in a culture where a reputation was more valuable than silver. As the family settled, a surprise knock rattled the outer door. It was the neighboring clan of the Black Fjord, a rough collection of warriors who had learned of the bog oak salvage and demanded a share under ancient Viking law. Finders keep half. Hostilities flared as weapons were drawn, only to be diffused by an impromptu offering of smoked turnips and mead. The Blackfjord clan, clearly not expecting culinary diplomacy, accepted a hasty truce, naming it the Oath of the Shared Ember. In return for the turnips, they pledged to lend 5 logs per week until the spring thaw, an act of generosity that smelled faintly of political calculation. Once the guests departed, the longhouse exhaled with relief. The hay-stuffed benches creaked as exhausted bodies collapsed, bundling themselves in furs like Shakespearean royalty. Just when sleep threatened to claim everyone, a shrill cry echoed through the rafters. "Wolf at the door!" Within seconds, half-drunken clansfolk tumbled from their nests, wielding torches and butcher's knives as if auditioning for a Valkyrie horror show. Outside loomed a lone wolf, its fur ragged, eyes glowing with hunger and contempt. The door was barred, flames rattling in torches as the beast circled the structure, snarling promises of dinner. Old Sigrid, no stranger to fending off predators, grabbed a pike and approached the door. She began to taunt the wolf in guttural Norse, telling it that the only treat tonight would be a mead-soaked boot. The wolf, for reasons unknown, snarled back, as if fluent in insult comedy. A tense standoff ensued, wolf versus witch, torchlight glinting against steel. Then, as if bored, the wolf retreated into the night, leaving behind hoofprints of frost and an aura of grudging respect. The clan cheered, congratulating Sigrid on her comedic timing and her refusal to share furs with vermin. Silence returned, broken only by the crackle of the hearth. Eyes grew heavy, each ember promising dreams of spring's distant warmth. But before surrendering to sleep, families traded final survival tips: how to brew a pine needle tea for scurvy prevention, where to find sheltered pockets of warm air near geothermal vents, and how to craft knitted mittens with thumb holes delicate enough to handle cooking spoons yet robust enough to survive an axe strike. As the longhouse drifted into snores and dreams of thawing rivers, one truth stood clear. Part 3 of the Viking winter saga was a roller coaster of ingenuity, dark humor, and the ever-present sting of cold. Bonds had deepened in adversity, alliances formed over bloodless battles for logs, and stories stitched the clan together like the furs that enveloped them. Tomorrow promised a continuation of this absurd survival opera, with new challenges, fresh embers, and the constant question, who would earn the next token for the warmest seat? The pale fingers of dawn stretched across the horizon, hinting at the end of another merciless night. Inside the longhouse, bodies stirred beneath layers of sodden pelts, groaning as though the very act of waking were a betrayal of comfort. In the corner, a single ember flickered, the last remnant of a fire meant to outlive the Ice Age itself. With a ceremonious grunt, Eric lunged at the hearth and tossed on the final piece of bog oak, watching the flames blaze with triumphant warmth as if celebrating their own survival. The clan exchanged bleary-eyed nods. This ember would carry them through their last frostbite rendezvous with death. Their first chore was the laundry, scraping inches of soot from tunics and pelts, an odyssey akin to shaving a yak with a seashell. The smoke-stained wool shed fragments like a bad haircut, and each garment smelled of primal warfare between animal hide and ember-scorched breath. Once sufficiently defanged, meaning minimally less filthy, they resumed water duties. The ice tunnel to the stream had frozen solid overnight, requiring a dawn expedition armed with pokers and curses. Bjorn, eager to prove his mettle, volunteered first. He lowered the bucket with the solemnity of a knight accepting a quest, only to yank it back moments later, its contents a slushy slurry of ice chunks and regretted decision-making. Muttering about the god's sense of humor, he retreated to thaw the bucket next to an ember pot, dripping water onto Sigurd's meticulously labeled prime porridge pile, earning him a glare that could freeze lava. Fueled by seconds of porridge-laced oatmeal, which could barely be called porridge anymore, more a ritualistic offering to the frost gods, the clan convened for their final midwinter strategy session. The map of the woodpile crisis was slapped onto the wall, charcoal scrawl depicting prime logs, reserves, and bog oak treasure. Ingrid, still riding her recent triumph, chaired the meeting from atop a stack of rune-etched stones, demanding a recount of tokens for the fireplace seating. While the token system had restored some semblance of order, complaints abounded that Aunt Freydis was hoarding tokens behind her back, stashing them in a sock stuffed with lichens. Disciplinary token forfeiture was proposed but vetoed when Freydis threatened to unleash a curse so potent it'd petrify whoever dared challenge her blanket monopoly. Attention then shifted to the Great Thaw preparation, an annual event marking the twilight of winter's reign. Legend held that the onset of the thaw could bring spontaneous roof collapses from accumulated snow, cellar floods from melting ground, and hordes of plague-soaked mosquitoes, spawned when mosquitoes awoke from frost-induced comas. To mitigate these threats, the clan devised a three-pronged approach: reinforce the roof with extra timbers, elevate their sleeping platforms above the rising moisture line, and develop a mosquito distraction device: pulverized bog myrtle mashed into torches to smoke out bloodthirsty insects. It was a venture equal parts genius and lunacy, but then survival in the frozen north rarely separated the two. Roof reinforcement began immediately. The longhouse rafters, already groaning like an old troll, were supplemented with crossbeams scavenged from abandoned barns. Gunnar, whose axe arm was still recovering from a near-fatal snow-shoveling incident, wielded a hammer that weighed as much as a rowboat. Each nail pounded and elicited groans from every corner, strain-induced sound effects that could have earned an Oscar for best dramatic grunting. By midday, the rafters looked like a latticework of skeletal arms reaching for the sky, capable of supporting an avalanche or a small dragon without batting an eye. Next came the elevation of bedding. The clan dismantled their makeshift beds, lifting and shoving timber frames higher, while muttering about the shame of having to climb extra rungs before bed. The new design resembled a crude loft, complete with rope ladders that swayed like drunken serpents. Eric tested the design by climbing up with a 3-pelt blanket, only to topple sideways and land in a foaming heap of indignity in sheep's wool. Laughter erupted, momentarily drowning out the sound of distant ice cracking under the weight of a thawing world. As dusk approached, attention turned to the mosquito project. A committee of 2, Sigrid and an overly enthusiastic thrall named Harold, dabbed black goop across pieces of driftwood, their faces smudged in a bizarre camouflage pattern. The mixture reeked of pine and decay, a perfume designed to repel or at least disorient any insect with enough survival instinct to want a drink of Viking blood. When the first torch was lit, the smoke curled lazily upward, carrying the scent through every crack in the longhouse. The effect was immediate. Chickens clucked in alarm, Freydis nearly choked, and Eric theatrically clutched his mead mug as though it were a life raft. Whether the mosquitoes would find the scent repellent or attractive remained to be tested. Either outcome promised interesting anecdotes. Midnight ceremonies loomed, the final Yule blot before the sun reclaimed the sky. This feast was a solemn, mead-fueled affair, blending reverence with revelry in equal measure. The clan sacrificed the last of their smallest livestock, a goat that had already donated most of its life to wool and cheese. The goat was marched around the hearth thrice, while participants chanted guttural invocations to Thor, Freyr, and whatever frost-bound deity might pity their existence. When the sacrificial blade finally descended, the goat bleated in Olympian proportions, shattering the solemn mood and sending everyone scattering for cover. It broke the tension, which was, after 3 months of huddling in the cold, precisely the intention. Once the animal fell silent, mead horns emerged, unceremoniously filled with a mixture so potent it threatened to ignite in solo combustion. Toasts rang out, to warmth, to bog oak, to fewer frost giant attacks, before participants staggered to their seats hugging their horns like newborn babes. Stories picked up where they'd left off. Harold swore he once fended off a frost giant with nothing but a chest of salted herring, while Bjorn recounted his debut in the ice hole diving contest, where he'd plunged into a gaping hole and emerged, confident that he'd discovered the undersea lair of Loki himself. When the mead haze thickened to the consistency of sleeping eiderdown, the clan adjourned to the hearth for the final ember ritual. Torches were doused to pitch-black darkness. Only the central hearth's flame remained, thrumming like a heartbeat in the void. Each member approached in turn, cupped hands over the fire, and whispered a personal vow, be it to chop more wood, hoard fewer tokens, or simply endure one more polar vortex without turning into a human popsicle. The act was less about the gods, and more about reaffirming their absurd pact, that together they would outlast the cold, the dark, and their own questionable culinary experiments. As the camera of history pans back, imagine this ragtag ensemble, soot-streaked faces, mismatched pelts, and eyes shining with a mix of delirium and defiance. They had bartered furs like stockbrokers, waged cold war over embers, and conjured engineering marvels from despair. They'd navigated bogs, quelled wolf sieges, brokered alliances with rival clans, and coaxed warmth from stone and hide. They'd hungered, coughed, collapsed, and laughed until their ribs ached more than frostbite. And now, as the first arrow of pale sunlight pierced the smoke-stained vent, they prepared for the grand finale of winter's reign. With a final collective grunt, the clan extinguished the hearth's last ember, burying its glowing core under ash and stone, preserving it for the next generation's myth-making. They climbed into their elevated beds, the ropes swaying like lullabies, and drew their pelts tight around shoulders half exposed to promise themselves a bit more heat. Outside, the world hummed with thaw's approach, ice dripping, snow settling, and the promise of mosquito swarms stirring in dark puddles. Yet inside, the longhouse stood as a testament to human absurdity and resilience, a monument of fur, fire, and farcical ingenuity. Sleep claimed them, each snore a victory chant against the cold. In their dreams, they danced with warm breezes and roasted marshmallows over hearth fires that needed no logs. When morning came, it would reveal a world half melted, half mourning the retreat of winter's brutal embrace. The thaw would bring mud, mosquitoes, and the arduous rebuilding of walls bowed by snow, but also the sweet jubilation of seeing grass again. And through it all, the clan would look back on their midwinter epic with equal parts horror and pride, knowing they'd survived the night by shared ingenuity, sarcastic banter, and the stubborn refusal to let a little thing like absolute zero spoil their sense of humor. Picture yourself on the windswept fjord cliff, gnawing on a slab of meat so tough it could double as a ship's sail. Your lips crack from salt and desperation, and you're wondering if that rubbery piece is salmon, reindeer, or perhaps the chewing gum of the gods. By the end of this, you'll learn why Viking larders were less pantry and more torture chamber for future meals. Winter is coming. I know, it's cliché, But when the sun vanishes for weeks and the wind howls through your longhouse like a vengeful Valkyrie, cliches become surprisingly relevant. For Norse families eking out a living on the edge of the world, preserving meat and fish wasn't a culinary art, it was an existential obligation. Fail at this, and you'd starve, get scurvy, or, worse yet, discover that your only available nutrition was a fungi colony masquerading as beef jerky. First, let's rewind to the tail end of summer, when the seas still glistened with cod and herring, and the forest teemed with moose and reindeer. Not that anyone thanked the moons of madness for the proximity of game. Vikings, after all, were too busy drinking mead to acknowledge natural blessings. But once harvests and hunts were in full swing, it was all hands on deck. Children herded sheep back to pens, thralls cleaned fish with the enthusiasm of dentists, and the skald sang paeans to salmon, while his mother shook her head and muttered that he'd never survive a winter without a proper diet. The centerpiece of fish preservation was salting. Ancient recipes might have you imagine neat layers of fish shimmering under coarse sea salt, but real life was less gourmet, more guerrilla warfare against spoilage. Massive wooden vats, essentially oversized salad bowls, were filled with alternating strata of gutted fish and heaps of salt harvested from evaporated tidal pools. When full, the vats were left to ferment in the sun for hours that felt like weeks, producing brine that smelled like a decaying sea monster. Don't worry, that smell was a good sign. It meant the salt had drawn out moisture and created an inhospitable environment for bacteria. Once the brine turned the color of whiskey and the fish felt like slightly soggy wood, the salted fish were removed and air-dried on racks carved from driftwood, often in the same yard that served as the communal outhouse, just to keep things interesting. In parallel, the meat brigade, primarily responsible for reindeer and pork, worked its own magic. Cutting meat into thin strips was the first step. Thin, in Viking parlance, meant about as wide as my hand when I'm hungover, which led to occasional culinary mishaps. Slabs so thick the interior remained icy, or so thin that they desiccated into sawdust. But repetition breeds perfection, or at least edible product. Strips were hung from wooden beams inside the longhouse, where smoke from the central hearth wafted up and enveloped them in a cold, aromatic haze. This was the origin of smokehouse, a term that in modern barbecues implies tasty ribs, but for Vikings meant nature's freezer with an added layer of charcoal. Smoke itself was a delicate science. Too much, and your meat tasted like a shipwreck. Too little, and you risked spoilage. Thralls monitored the smoldering logs, usually birch or juniper chosen for their pleasant mocha notes, and added new branches every few hours, while chanting prayers to the fire spirit, Logi. These chants often devolved into complaints about smoke in the eyes and joints aching from the cold. Legends claim the goddess Sif whispered smoking secrets to mortal women, but evidence suggests it was more a matter of trial, error, and the occasional bout of food poisoning. Meanwhile, the Vikings had an ace up their sleeve: fermentation. Yes, those same folks who raided and pillaged also experimented with controlled spoilage. A fish ferment called surströmming, later adopted by neighbors, involved burying whole herring in barrels, letting them stew in their own juices for months. The result? A fragrant delicacy that, when opened, cleared entire villages of wolves. For Vikings, however, it was a cheap protein source. Just one swing of the barrel and the family had preserved enough fish to fuel future raids. But let's pause on that image. The Viking teenager, rabid with hunger, unscrewing the lid of a surströmming barrel for the first time. The release of gas sounded like Thor cracking his knuckles, and the stench wafted out in a greenish cloud. Neighbors peeked from their longhouses, saw the vapor, and retreated 3 valleys away. Yet the kid took one whiff, gave a thumbs up between coughs, and bit into a slimy fish before falling into a coughing fit that lasted until spring thaw. That's commitment to protein macros. Salt and smoke were mainstays, but drying took on multiple guises. In northern communities, the winter sun was a 4 p.m. affair, insufficient to fully evaporate moisture. Enter wind drying stations, open-air racks erected on the coastal cliffs, where gusty sea breezes whipped through the layers of meat and fish like a demented hairdryer. Birds often tried to snack on the dangling strips, prompting nightly guard duty armed with sticks. Just picture 2 thralls in wolf pelts thwacking seagulls at 2 a.m., swearing they were protecting the meat of the gods. It was less romantic than it sounds. High-value items like salmon were sometimes smoked, then wind-dried, a double treatment that produced a product both firmer than wood and infinitely more flammable. Storage of these prized cuts was equally dramatic. They were packed into barrels with layers of salt and sometimes pine resin, then sealed with wax. Imagine cracking open a barrel months later. You'd break through a wax seal, dredge out a hunk of salmon the size of a child's arm, and carve off shards that you'd rehydrate by boiling. This method preserved the fish until the next spring, and also equipped Vikings with excellent missile projectiles in case of castle sieges. Beyond these staples, Vikings got creative when resources were scarce. In lean seasons, they experimented with meat puck, ground scraps mixed with salvaged seaweed or moss, pressed into dense cakes and dried. It wasn't gourmet, it was survival compressed. Families joked that a single meat puck could hit you like a mace and fill your stomach for days. Children played a dangerous game of meat puck hockey, which ended predictably in bruised shins and complaints about spoiled playthings. Not all experiments succeeded. One ill-fated village tried pickling reindeer tongue in stale mead, believing the sugar would preserve it. Instead, they discovered fermentation's darker side. The tongue swelled explosively inside sealed jars, shattering wooden walls at 3 a.m. Legend says the ensuing mead pickle explosion echoed like dragon wings, inspiring nearby settlers to double down on salt and smoke and avoid sugar-based culinary alchemy. Industrial-scale preservation required impressive communal coordination. Every fall, villages organized preserve-a-thon events. Thralls, farmers, and warriors alike convened to gut fish, sprinkle salt, build smoke racks, and dance wildly to stave off the cancerous stench of fermenting barrels. The atmosphere was part festival, part medieval OSHA hazard. You'd see drunk skalds reciting epic poems as they lugged barrels, while matrons slapped them on the back and warned, "Don't spill the brine, or we'll have a sea monster in the yard again." In coastal areas, where fishing fleets brought in daily hauls, communities built stone smokehouses, small hutches with slits for smoke ventilation and hooks for hanging fish. These structures became social hubs. Dripping skins and fillets jostled like sardines in a tin, and locals swapped recipes, try adding juniper berries, or bragged about surviving last winter's gale that knocked down half their smokehouse. That sort of damage control escalated into real estate politics. Your smokehouse fell? Well, maybe don't build it on that eroding cliff, Bjorn. And then there's the dark art of ice cellar storage. In cooler valleys, families dug pits into the permafrost, lining them with planks and insulating with straw. During late autumn, they'd cram the cellar with meat and fish, pack snow around it, and seal it with wooden lids. Inside, temperatures hovered just above freezing, perfect for cold-curing sausages and slabs of meat. The downside, thieves could pry open the lids and help themselves, leading to legendary revenge stories involving sharpened icicles and surprise chill raids at dawn. Religiosity seeped into preservation practices too. Some clans believed the Norse god, Njord, patron of the sea, blessed their vats if they offered a dribble of mead during the salting process. Others carved runes into barrels to ward off putrefaction. While archaeologists debate whether these inscriptions actually influenced spoilage, locals swore by them, and cross-examining a barrel was more entertaining than watching reindeer ice skate across the fjord. Come winter, the payoff was a larder so stocked that spring melt barely registered on the clan's menu. Salted cod stews, smoking meats that you could hang near the hearth and cook on demand, and fermented fish cheese that aged like blue cheese but smelled like Poseidon's inner ear. During particularly frigid storms, when hunting was impossible, families gathered for communal meals, eating preserved fare by candlelight, swapping tall tales of last summer's raids, and toasting to the miracle that their previous selves had salted and smoked enough to keep them alive. Yes, it's absurd. Yes, your modern freezer spoils far less, but there's a strange romance in knowing that every bite you chew was transformed by sweat, brine, fire, and a dash of Norse superstition. It was less farm to table and more fjord to fire to freezer, a culinary triathlon demanding endurance, ingenuity, and the moral flexibility to chew on reindeer moss when pressed. By mid-autumn, the great salting vats and smoke racks were humming with activity. But the Vikings knew that true mastery of preservation required more than brute force and brine. Part 2 of our saga begins with the art of spicing, a delicate dance that turned repulsive scraps into borderline gourmet, and kept morale from plummeting faster than a longship in open seas. Spice racks in Viking homesteads were humble affairs, wooden planks nailed to walls, holding earthenware bowls of local herbs, juniper berries, wild thyme, and the occasional pinch of imported fennel seed, a luxury obtained through cautious trade with Frankish merchants. The process started by lightly rubbing coarse salt into each strip of meat, then dusting it with a judicious sprinkling of crushed juniper. Not only did this mask lingering gamey odors, it also introduced antiseptic oils, an early form of antibiotic, if you squinted hard enough. Women performed this ritual with the solemnity of high priests, chanting the blessing, "May the berries ward off both spoilage and hallucinations of frost giants." Once spiced, the meat went through a dual-stage cure. First came the cold cure, laying strips on slatted racks inside the ice cellar, where sub-zero humidity slowly leached moisture. Checkpoints were scheduled daily. Servants would tap each piece, listening for the hollow thok that signified optimal dryness. Too soggy, and the meat risked rot. Too brittle, and it turned into something resembling a mandolin's tuning peg, nearly inedible. Connoisseurs of cured meats bragged about just right thoks, comparing their yields like aristocrats comparing jewels. After cold curing, the real drama unfolded in the smokehouse. Unlike the open-air drying racks, these hutches were sealed chambers where thick plumes of aromatic smoke swirled endlessly. Stratified wood compartments held slabs of venison or pork, suspended over smoldering embers. The chamber's only ventilation came through a narrow chimney, ensuring the smoke lingered like a lingering ex-lover. Guards posted at the door studiously recorded every batch's entry and exit times, 24 hours for bacon, 36 for venison, and a legendary 72 for the Great Bear ham. A slab rumored large enough to host a tavern brawl, if the brawlers could bite through it. Meanwhile, fish preservation evolved beyond simple salting to embrace brining techniques that bordered on mixology. Vats of fish brine were infused with wild herbs and a splash of mead, creating a concoction that fermented in wooden barrels. Brewers claimed this mead brine imparted a subtle sweetness, taming the briny brutality of salted cod. Barrels were rolled regularly, part practicality, part superstition, so the mixture didn't settle and spoil. Senior brewers rattled their wooden stirring paddles at less experienced thralls, warning them that a single missed stir could doom an entire family's winter rations. When the brine was perfectly tart, fish were extracted and strung on twine lines for wind drying. Coastal cliffs once again played host to these fillet festivals, but now with added flair, rhythmic dances around the racks to the beat of drum-making whales' vertebrae, intended to drive away seabirds through auditory intimidation. These performances drew audiences from miles around, families bringing children in tow to witness the spectacle and grab a few sun-dried cod bones for teething toddlers. Not content to rely solely on salt, smoke, and wind, the Vikings experimented with oil preservation. Seal oil, prized for its resistance to rancidity, was heated and combined with rendered animal fat to form a viscous bath. Fish fillets and meat chunks were submerged in earthenware jars filled with this mobile fat lock and sealed with beeswax. When the jars were unstoppered months later, families dredged out tender morsels encased in golden oil, which they spooned directly into porridge, stew, or, on particularly celebratory nights, straight into open mouths like drunken sailors polishing. Off loot. The scale of preservation efforts prompted entrepreneurial ventures. Enterprising thralls established preservation guilds, complete with membership badges crafted from polished walrus ivory. Guild meetings were held in smoke-filled taverns where seasoned preservers swapped recipes under strict oath of secrecy, similar to modern secret societies but with significantly higher risk of salmonella. Apprentices endured salt boot camp, learning to gut fish blindfolded, identify rancid cuts by taste, a practice now outlawed by every food safety agency, and recite preservation runes to the tune of Hallelujah played on a bone flute. Trade networks blossomed around preserved goods. Coastal clans shipped barrels of salted herring to inland settlements in exchange for cured reindeer meat and jars of honey. Caravans traverse fjords and longboats fitted with storage nooks beneath the deck, each cargo bay inhaling brine-scented air and creaking under the weight of communal sustenance. At trade fairs, merchants hawked their wares with boastful cries. "My surströmming will rouse your ancestors from Valhalla," or "My smoked elk ham cures more than hunger, it cures regret." These hyperbolic claims were part marketing, part prophetic curse. No one wanted to accidentally consume someone else's spoiled scraps. Back in the villages, families monitored their larders with obsessive care. Snow-covered cellars acquired ice-watch timetables where male youths congregated nightly to replenish insulation layers and check for leaks in the permafrost walls. One breach, and waterlogged meat turned to mush, dissolving months of labor into a gray ooze. Rumors circulated of secret tunnels between cellars, used by petty thieves who fancied themselves night-crawl gourmands, snatching ribs under moonlight like culinary cat burglars. Festivals marked key milestones in the preservation calendar. The brine blessing took place on the first frost, when families paraded salted fish through the village, brandishing them like totem poles while chanting pleas for long winters and short spoilage. Children competed in fish-flinging contests. Who could catapult a cod the farthest without cracking its head? Winners received extra salting duties, no honor without sacrifice, and a prized cod bone necklace displayed proudly at the hearth until it snapped under the weight of bragging rights. As midwinter approached, diets homogenized into a rotation of preserved fare. Salted fish stew on Mondays, dried meat porridge on Tuesdays, smoked jerky with berry compote on Wednesdays, and experimental mashups, like reindeer tongue pickled in brine, on Thursdays. Fridays were reserved for meat puck sandwiches smeared with seal oil mayonnaise, a treat that prompted family members to gather for communal teeth-brushing sessions by the hearth. Saturdays featured feasts of mixed preserved goods, a cacophony of textures that resembled a Viking version of tapas, only chewier and with a higher sodium content. But no preservation method was without peril. Accidents abounded. Vats burst under pressure, drenching longhouses in brine. Smokehouses collapsed under their own weight, burying meats in dank rubble. And oil preservation jars exploded like miniature volcanic blasts, showering walls and patrons with rancid fat. Stories of the Great Brine Flood, when a careless thrall knocked over a vat, releasing thousands of gallons of foul-smelling liquid, became the stuff of legend, a cautionary tale told around the fire. Remember young Shell, whose brine spill sent half the village into exile for a month. Through trials and tribulations, Viking societies refined their preservation techniques into a cultural cornerstone. They celebrated the alchemy of salt, smoke, wind, and fat with songs, sagas, and satirical scalding verses. Preservation became more than survival. It became identity, a proud symbol of resilience in the face of frost and famine. As the hearth embers of Part 2 glow faintly in our memory, we stand on the brink of even more ingenious, and occasionally catastrophic, methods awaiting in Part 3. From underground smoke tunnels to glacier-aged meat vaults, the next chapter promises further absurdity, dark humor, and the relentless thrill of knowing that a single spoiled barrel could end the saga before winter's end. As the first snows of midwinter settled like a heavy wool blanket over the Nordic landscape, preservation efforts entered their most daring phase. In hushed corridors beneath the longhouse, families had begun excavating smoke tunnels, a network of narrow, clay-lined channels that wove between root cellars and hearths. These tunnels channeled smoke from the main fire directly through chambers hung with meat, ensuring an even, low-temperature cure that no seagull or marauding neighbor could sully. Ingenious on paper. In reality, the smoke tunnels often backfired, literally, when an overzealous thrall misjudged the draft, resulting in bursts of flame erupting from secret vents and sending panicked villagers scrambling with buckets of snow. The tunnel's unintended consequence: pheasants flying through hidden apertures, shrieking like small banshees and scattering cured venison in their frantic wake. Meanwhile, above ground in the attic loft, an underused space previously reserved for spider farms, pioneers of freeze-drying experimented with hanging slabs of reindeer meat on rafters, exposing them to the brutal winds whipping through unglazed windows. The result was meat so brittle it shattered like stained glass shards whenever touched. Children delighted in picking up fistfuls of frost shards and pretending they were magical healing crystals. Unfortunately, ingesting them produced a jarring crunch that rattled teeth and left tongues pleading for porridge. Grandmother Sigrid labeled these shards the Valkyrie chips and decreed them an optional treat, warning that they were best consumed only after thawing over embers for several hours. Deeper in the valley, enterprising villagers discovered the perfect underground vault, a glacier-carved cavern whose interior walls dripped with eternal ice. Accessed by a wooden ramp slick with moss, this natural freezer maintained sub-zero temperatures year-round. Meat and fish were packed into watertight barrels, submerged in icy meltwater, then sealed and lowered into the cavern's depths. Retrieval required plunging one's arm into frigid pools, eliciting screams that echoed through the ice like the wails of long-forgotten warriors. Yet the payoff was undeniable. Perfectly preserved salmon fillets that, when thawed, retained a supple texture no salt-dried fish could match. Word spread, and soon clans traded boiled-down fish oil in exchange for the glacier's cellaring rights, leading to the first recorded Cold War over subterranean real estate. Back in the Longhouse, preservation lore had taken on ritualistic overtones. At midnight on the winter solstice, families gathered to whisper to their barrels of brined herring, softly coaxing the fish to stay fresh until spring's first thaw. Whether the fish understood Norse gibberish is debatable, but the practice did wonders for morale. One particularly zealous skald composed an epic verse in honor of the pickling vats, comparing the brine to the salty tears of Loki himself, an image that haunted thralls as they lugged barrels from vat to cellar. As day yielded to night, the acid pickling brigade took center stage. Inspired by foreign merchants, some Vikings began experimenting with vinegar-like solutions, created by fermenting cider in oak barrels for months. Every bowl of pickled reindeer tongue or brined fish was an exercise in bravery. Taste too little vinegar, and you risked botulism. Too much, and your tongue shriveled like a raisin tossed into a dragon's mouth. The local apothecary thrall, Gudrun, kept a ledger of vinegar-to-water ratios, each entry smeared with pickling slime and indecipherable by anyone not versed in her cryptic handwriting. Despite its dangers, acid pickling's bold flavors made it a coveted holiday fare, reserved for those with iron stomachs and questionable life insurance. Smoke tunnels, glacier vaults, attic freeze experiments, and acid pickling were only part of the story. Across the fjord, coastal clans had devised salt caves by packing rugged limestone caves with tons of sea salt, creating giant natural brining vats. Game birds, fish, and even entire halves of sheep were suspended inside these caves, where salt crystals formed thick incrustations. Retrieval was a delicate process of chipping away layers of salt, each strike sending showers of white powder into the air. The final reveal: perfectly preserved meat, firm as soapstone, with a lingering crunch of crystallized salt that could strip paint from walls. Visiting traders marveled at the sight, dubbing the process cave candy, a misnomer that stuck despite its extreme sodium content. Preservation prowess also fostered niche specializations. One eccentric clan invented herb infusion barrels, where meat was layered with fresh spruce needles, seaweed, and juniper sprigs between layers of salt. As the mixture cured, volatile oils from the botanicals seeped into the flesh, imparting an aroma reminiscent of forest floor after rain. The resulting ham, when finally carved, sent aromatic plumes curling through the longhouse, temporarily masking the stench of decaying fish in neighboring cellars. Connoisseurs savored each bite as though it were the nectar of the gods, until they remembered that the only thing more dangerous than rotting meat was potential allergies to pine resin. Not to be outdone, the inland mountain hamlet boasted the rock roast method. Thick slabs of venison were sandwiched between heated stones, then wrapped in cloth and buried beneath coals. Over hours, the meat slow roasted while retaining moisture, an early sous vide, minus the precision thermostat. When unwrapped, the meat emerged tender enough to slice with a spatula, yet imbued with a smoky earthiness that had warriors weeping tears of joy, and warlords plotting conquests just to sample a morsel. The technique, though time-consuming, became a rite of passage. Only those who had endured the smoldering earth burial could claim true Viking culinary honor. Despite these marvels, preservation was never foolproof. Each method carried risks that fueled tall tales around the hearth. Thralls whispered of the night of 1,000 rats, when a poorly sealed barrel invited rodents to a midnight banquet. The ensuing rat swarm impregnated the larder with vermin and forced a fortnight-long larder quarantine, during which families lived off leftover meat and wild mushrooms, another culinary experiment that ended when half the tribe hallucinated giant elk dancing in the snow. Then came the mystery mold epidemic. A stray barrel of salted cod developed neon-hued fungal blooms that looked like bioluminescent coral. Curiosity drove the bold to taste it. Regret drove them back to the hearth, clutching their bellies and vowing to stick to tried-and-true juniper brines. Elder Gudmund swore the mold was a divine sign, emblazoned by Odin himself, but most villagers simply blamed poor barrel craftsmanship. As winter deepened, preservation turned into a spectator sport. Villagers wagered on which batch of meat would spoil first, handing over handfuls of fish bones as entry fees and cheering as rancid odors drifted through open windows. Winners received prime seats at the communal feast in the honor of tossing spoiled scraps to the fire, the ultimate symbolic gesture of triumph over decay. Trade fairs in the frozen months showcased preservation mastery. Merchants arrived in longboats with decks lined by barrels glinting gold with seal oil. They offered VIP tastings of cured goods, charging admission in woven reed tokens. The bravest sampled fermented blubber butter, a spread so potent it induced tears and confessions of childhood traumas. The least courageous merely sniffed and backed away, vowing to stick to their grandmother's salt and smoke regimen. In quieter moments, families turned preservation into art. Children carved wooden plaques depicting scenes of victory over putrefaction, heroic thralls wrestling with giant vats, mothers serenading brine barrels, and skalds summarizing each method in epic couplets. These plaques adorned cellars like trophies, reminding everyone of the creative insanity that went into ensuring dinner on the longest nights. Festive contests punctuated the season. The great salt ball toss pitted teams against each other, hurling fist-sized salt balls at suspended meat targets. Scores were tallied by the number of clean hits, an exercise that often ended with contestants face down in snow, sputtering brine and cursing the salt god for their slippery offenses. Winners claimed jars of rare smoked moose tongue and bragging rights until the thaw. As the solstice moon waned, the time came to test the fruits of months of labor. Families erected long wooden tables in the smokehouse courtyard, layering them with slabs of frozen fish, barrels of salted pork, clay jars of pickled tongue, and baskets of brittle freeze-dried shards. Neighbors and traveling merchants gathered under lantern light for the feast of frozen plenty. Each guest received a wooden platter piled high, along with a horn of warmed mead to wash down the onslaught of textures, chewy, crunchy, melting, abrasive. Conversations buzzed with analysis. This loin has a hint of spruce. Your cod brine is too tangy. Who fermented this with mead vinegar? Madness. Between bites, attendees shared survival lore, how to recycle used brine for planting winter barley, a method that sometimes rendered fields impossibly salty, or how to use leftover fish bones as fertilizer for root vegetables. The most enterprising even demonstrated preserve and forget, burying meat in snowdrifts marked by runic staves and retrieving it months later for a surprise catch, often discovering that the snow had acted as its own freezing vault, leaving meat in pristine, albeit bone-chilling condition. By the feast's end, bellies bulged and tongues tingled. Guests staggered away under a glittering sky, clutching small parcels of preserved goods to tide them over until spring. The longhouse, once a battleground of barrels and smoke, settled into a hush broken only by the gentle drip of melting ice from the smoke tunnels. In the flickering hearthlight, families exchanged knowing glances. They had conquered brine, tamed smoke, harnessed ice, and flirted with fermentation's dark side. They'd outwitted seagulls, rats, mold, and the occasional frost giant, or so the stories claimed. And as they hung one last slab of meat near the hearth for good measure, they toasted to the absurd ingenuity that had turned mortal fear of starvation into a grand spectacle of human creativity. But the greatest triumph was this: when spring thaw finally arrived, and families cracked open their final Glacier Vault barrel, they found salmon so supple it practically sang beneath their knives. In that moment, amid tears of joy and triumphant laughter, they understood that preserving meat and fish was more than a culinary necessity. It was a testament to Viking resilience, a saga of salt, smoke, ice, and the stubborn refusal to let even the fiercest winter claim victory. As the first shoots of crocus and snowdrop peeked through the thawing snow, the longhouse stirred for its final preservation saga. No more brine vats to tend, no more smoke tunnels to clear, and certainly no more fear of barrels exploding like miniature volcanoes in the night. Yet the work was far from over. Spring's promise came with its own perils, and Viking ingenuity never rested. Morning light fell through the soot-streaked vent as the clan gathered for the defrosting ritual. This ceremony involved carefully unsealing the ice cellars, inspecting each barrel and crate for moisture damage, and chanting a protective rune over every package. The chant, Fjorgrunnar Lefna Froster Flighty, Spring Rebirth Begone Frost, was spoken in unison, echoing through the timber halls like a rallying cry against decay. Younger thralls, armed with wooden paddles, poked at ice layers to help loosen lids, while elders looked on with pride, knowing that each intact barrel represented countless hours of labor and ingenuity. First in line were the smokehouse's final exports, venison hams cured over half a season, their deep mahogany hues promising succulence. Each slab was carefully unwrapped from its protective wrappings of birch bark and beeswax coatings, revealing fragrant layers of fat and meat. The crowd applauded as the first slice was carved, its edges glistening with residual oils. A taste test panel of clan elders sampled the ham, nodded in solemn approval, and awarded it the highest honor, a mead horn gilded with a single reindeer antler. Among them, old Sigrid, now the undisputed smoke mistress, declared it worthy of Odin's feast table, prompting cheers and a round of hearty "Skål." Next came the barrels of salted fish. Each lid, sealed months earlier with a ritualistic knot of spruce twine, was carefully loosened. Vapors of brine escaped in gentle plumes, carrying the aromatic tang of sea air. Strips of cod and herring, rehydrated by the cellar's moisture, were rinsed in fresh spring water, scooped from the crystal-clear creek now freed of ice, and laid out on wooden plank tables. The fish, firm yet yielding, took on a delicate chewiness, its surface glimmering with salt crystals that sparkled like starlight. Children darted forward to snag small samples, their faces puckered with salt but bright with delight. From the glacier vault arrived the piece de resistance, salmon fillets of impossible tenderness. Masterfully thawed by laying them near smoldering embers for exactly 7 minutes, the salmon released a sweet, buttery scent that transformed the longhouse into a perfumed sanctuary. Each fillet was filleted further into bite-sized morsels, drizzled with a blend of seal oil and juniper-infused melted fat, and handed out like tactical rations for a battle against hunger. No one battled long. The first bites were met with murmurs of awe and delighted exclamations about spring in a mouthful. The final flourish called for a communal feast, uniting all preservation techniques in one grand table. Wedges of glacier salmon, slices of smokehouse ham, wind-dried Valkyrie chips rehydrated in broth, pickled reindeer tongue flambéed over embers, and mustard seed spiced meat pucks pan-fried to crisp perfection. Berries preserved in honey added a sweet counterpoint, and a final bowl of mead brine poached eggs offered a rich, unexpected umami twist. The longhouse erupted in laughter and applause as each dish was presented, a celebration of human ingenuity triumphing over nature's harshest trials. Between courses, clansfolk swapped stories of preservation, mishaps, and unlikely successes. Eric recounted the time he accidentally fermented a vat of brine in the attic, turning the entire upper floor into a pickle-scented labyrinth. Aunt Freydis remembered her great salt ball toss victory, only to have her prize codbone necklace melt in her pocket over the months. Grandmother Sigrid boasted of her smoke tunnel triumph, until she admitted she'd once plugged the tunnel vents with moss, causing a backflow of smoke that rendered half the larder inedibly charred. Each confession was met with sympathetic winks and tales of personal blunders, forging bonds of camaraderie deeper than any frost-bound trench. As the feast wound down, attention turned to future preservation improvements. The clan elder council, their bellies full and spirits high, convened beneath the rafters hung with empty racks. They proposed innovations for the coming year, reinforced stone smokehouses with angled roofs to prevent collapse under snow, glazed attic windows to allow controlled freeze-drying without wind damage, and modular barrel designs that incorporated spring-loaded vents to release built-up gases safely. A design subcommittee sketched rudimentary blueprints on birch bark, sometimes soggy from mead-stained fingers, yet brimming with potential. Thralls, too, had earned recognition. Many were granted the rare privilege of purchasing their freedom through contributions to the Preservation Guild. 3 perfect barrels of salted fish, a smoked elk ham, or a sealed jar of pickled tongue free of explosions. The Guild's ivory badge awaited each new master, an emblem of expertise in brine, smoke, and frost. With the larder fully emptied of the season's bounty, and rightly so, for few wanted to sleep surrounded by last winter's relics, the longhouse prepared to restore order. Smoke tunnels were sealed, barrels dismantled for reuse, and hearth embers banked for the next ritual. Walls rubbed clean of brine residue and fat smudges, and the thralls scrubbed the wooden floors until the boards glowed. Yet the air still carried faint echoes of fermentation, an olfactory memory of trials overcome. As dusk fell, families gathered by the hearth for the sun rebirth blessing. Each member held a small token, an acorn, a carved rune pendant, or a sprig of fir, blessed by a skald who recited verses venerating spring's return and the bounty it promised. Tokens were tossed into the hearth flames with prayers that next winter's preservation would be smoother, safer, and yield even grander feasts. Sparks rose like fireflies, carrying hopes of prosperity on their fleeting wings. Outside, the fjord reflected the last gleam of day, melting into a palette of indigo and rose. The longhouse, once a crucible of salt and smoke, stood quiet but proud, a monument to the absurd lengths humans would go to stave off starvation. In its walls lay lessons carved by fire and ice, that necessity breeds creativity, that humor can temper the bitterest experiences, and that shared struggle for survival forges the strongest bonds. In the soft glow of the hearth, old Sigrid leaned on her walking staff, surveying the clan with a satisfied grin. "Remember," she said in a voice raspy from smoke inhalation, "no matter how foul the brine, how fierce the frost, or how dubious the experiment, we will prevail. For as long as we have salt, smoke, and a stubborn refusal to admit defeat, the Vikings shall never starve." A collective skál rose in response, echoing into the rafters and beyond, into the fjord's icy mists, through the budding forests, and over the long winter stories yet to be told. Imagine you're tossed atop a deck slick with seawater and ice, waves crashing over your head like angry sea gods, and you're wondering if your only choice is to cling to a rope or become fish supper. Your fingers are so numb you can't knot a sail, your teeth chatter Morse code for help, and you're pretty sure your ancestors are face-palming across Valhalla. Stick with me, because this is no gentle cruise. It's survival at the bottom of the world's most vengeful bathtub. The sky is a bruised purple bruise, the horizon a wavering smear between sea and storm. There is no good morning at sea in a Norse gnar, only a series of curses muttered through chattering teeth as sailors wrestle dripping ropes and half-frozen sails. These men and women set out from fjords that looked inviting in summer, but out here in winter, the sea is an underworld of teeth, biting, snapping, dragging ships into watery graves. Step 1, prepare your vessel. Modern sailors have GPS, metal hulls, and heated cabins. Vikings had wooden planks, woolen tunics, and a burning ember inside a hollowed-out gourd to start fires, assuming they could keep it alight through storms that would drown a whale. They'd seal the seams of their longships with animal hair and pine tar, a primitive caulk that smelled like charred bacon and hope. But sealed was a relative term. Water seeped in like a persistent rumor, and every plank flexed under pressure, groaning like an ancient beast in pain. Imagine your life, second mate, mid-voyage to Greenland. You're perched on that gunwale, half submerged, bailing with a gourd so cracked it leaks faster than it scoops. Each scoop is a baptism into freezing oblivion. Your woolen underlayer is soaked. Your outer cloak stiffens into armor you never asked for. Between scoops, you cling to the mast, screaming encouragements to the sky. "Dear Thor, if you could give us a break, or maybe a smaller wave, that'd be great." Down below, the hold is chaos. Barrels of salted fish roll like drunken revelers, crushing crates of dried meat. The few thralls aboard stumble over loose cargo, wincing as salted cod skitters across the wet deck, and cracks a thrall's shin. Above, shields strapped to the rails offer a sliver of windbreak, but half of them have washed overboard, rattling like ghosts in the gale. The crew's warmth comes from huddling in the lee of the mast, trading body heat and insults in equal measure. Storms at sea don't arrive with a polite knock. They crash down with the subtlety of a berserker war cry. Clouds coil overhead, and what began as a stiff breeze escalates into a gale fit for Ragnarok. Each gust snaps at the sails, bending masts like they're made of wet reed. Sails torn to ribbons flap like wounded birds, and if you're unlucky, a yardarm snaps overhead, slamming you into the deck with enough force to rearrange your lunch and possibly your spine. Keeping warm is an art form. The crew layers wool, linen, and the occasional animal pelt scavenged from previous raids. But at sea, the sea spray, salt-laden and bone-chilling, soaks through every layer. Hands go numb and furs mat into sodden rags. The best defense against frostbite is motion, but motion here means hauling lines, furling sails, and heaving on oars until your shoulder joints threaten mutiny. Oarlocks groan, oars creak, backs protest in a symphony of agony. But still, they row because rest means hypothermia. Food on these voyages is a bleak affair. Hardtack that could chew diamonds, salted fish resembling petrified sardines, and thin gruel heated over a miniature fire barrel, if someone can keep the flame alive through driving wind. Hot mead is a luxury, but the mead aboard is lukewarm at best, carried in skins that drip halfway into your lap. Even so, when that soupy brew sloshes across your numbing tongue, it tastes like Olympus. But survival demands more than brute strength. It requires cunning. Take the practice of reefing, reducing sail area to keep the ship manageable in high winds. Crews would roll up the lower sails, tie them with spare rope, and lash the yardarms close to the mast. It was a delicate dance. Do too little, and the ship heels dangerously. Do too much, and you lose steerage. The helmsman, standing in a waist-deep puddle of cold, whether or not he can feel his legs, watch the rudder. A single plank lashed onto the sternpost like a newborn babe. One wrong shift, and the Nar spins broadside to the waves, a sure recipe for capsizing. Once the rigging is tamed, the next trick is to heave to, positioning the oars and the sail so the ship rides the waves without taking them broadside. It's an awkward, counterintuitive posture, like leaning backward into harm's way to avoid falling forward off a cliff. But it works. The bow rises to meet each wave, the stern settles in the trough, and the ship surges forward slowly, like a wounded beast. It's cold, wet, and humiliating, but at least it's survivable. Below decks, life is no picnic. The hold is a swamp of melting snow, salted provisions, and motion that sends you sliding into the ship's ribs. Sleep is impossible if you value your vertebrae. Sailors catch naps in shifts of 2 hours, huddled in corners with wool wrapped around their faces. They trade stories of past storms, each more harrowing than the last, exaggerating the size of waves and the malevolence of the sea. The skald, the ship's storyteller, recites sagas to keep spirits from plunging into despair. His verses are peppered with references to Njord and Aegir, patrons of sea and wind, hoping to curry divine favor. But when the ship pitches violently, tales give way to action. Water surges through leaks, and the gourd, bailing brigade, often the lowest status crew members, rush to plug holes with tar-soaked rags. These emergency caulking patches hold for minutes before washing out, requiring constant vigilance. The captain, usually a weathered veteran with frost-rimed beard, paces the deck, barking orders, his voice muffled by frozen mittens. His eyes scan the sky for signs of change, a shift in cloud color, a lull in the wind, anything that hints the storm may relent. Communication at sea is a chorus of shouted commands, each word half lost to wind and wave. "Sheet home! Haul aft! Brace the yards!" Sailors respond with grunt and gruntled enthusiasm, knowing that compliance could be the difference between life and a long swim in sub-zero water. Every motion is choreographed. Every rope has its handholds timed to prevent limbs from being yanked into rigging. When the storm reaches its apex, the deck becomes a perilous obstacle course. Slippery planks, swinging spars, and wave tops cresting above the gunwales, ready to sweep the unwary man overboard. Falling overboard is literal death sentence. It's nearly impossible to reboard in storm seas, and the cold saps strength before hypothermia claims you. To guard against this, Norse sailors employed lifelines, ropes tied around the waist and clipped to fixed points on deck. The concept sounds modern, but these primitive tethers could save lives. Of course, if a wave was strong enough to snap a rope or wash away its anchor point, you were still out of luck, but it was better than nothing. When at last the storm abated, a process that felt like the world exhaling after whole lifetimes of screaming, the crew surveyed the damage. Sails hung in tatters, rigging was frayed to the brink, and the ship listed slightly from the weight of waterlogged gear. The skipper ordered a full pump operation. Abandoning all pretense of dignity, every seafarer grabbed buckets and worked the ship's bilge in unison, a Greek chorus of splashes and curses. Water flew overhead, and each man's cheeks flamed with exertion. Against the relic of freezing gale, this was mild torture but required, because no Viking wanted to be a slow, soggy tomb at the bottom of the North Sea. Repairs followed. Seamen scurried along yards to tie up broken spars, using spare tar and rope. Sail patches were sewn by thrall-handed seamstresses, who by rights should have refused, but faced the alternative of being set adrift in a patched-up dinghy. The ship's carpenter swung his mallet, driving new pegs into planks, sealing each seam with pine resin churned from Bifrost's own heart. And everywhere, the skald interjected witty observations. "There's nothing like being pummeled by the ocean to remind you that your mother never wanted you," he quipped, earning a laugh that tasted of relief and frostbite. By nightfall, the men staggered to the prow, scanning the Black Sea for sight of land, or at least calmer water. When a distant flicker of shore lights appeared, they hoisted a cheer that echoed across the waves, startling seabirds into a frenetic exodus. Someone passed around diluted mead, each sip a sacrament of survival. The cold still bit, but now it was a deserved cold. You had bested the storm, kept your chapter in the sagas, and lived to sail another day. As the Nar drifted toward a sheltered cove, ropes were stowed, sails furled, and a watch was set. Even on land, memories of the storm haunted them. Every creak of timber, every gust of wind reminded them of the sea's capacity for cruelty. Yet they slept, for the day had been won. Their muscles still humming from the storm's aftermath, the crew wasted no time slipping back into the rhythm of life at sea, an existence defined by damp misery and reluctant exhilaration. With half the sails patched and the hull still dripping from the pump, the Norse seafarers set their eyes westward, longing for far-off shores that promised timber, pasture, and an end to bailing. But the sea is a fickle mistress, and the calm that followed the gale was merely an interlude. By dawn's pale light, the lookout spotted slender spires of icebergs glinting on the horizon like tombstones for unwary vessels. These mountains of the deep had the power to crush a longship's hull like a nutshell. The captain, a crusty veteran whose hair was more white than gray, barked orders to shift course a few degrees south. At this latitude, the ice fields were notoriously unpredictable. Growling sheets of ice would drift without warning, and a vessel caught unawares risked a wooden noose around her keel. So the crew maintained ice watches, relaying signals with bared teeth and hand-harrying before the tide could carry them into danger. Navigating by sun and stars is romantic until cloud cover erases every reference point. With the sun playing hide-and-seek behind steel clouds, the navigator resorted to his trusty solar compass, a bowl of water with a floating needle, rigged so it would align with the sun's shadow. A device so simple that even a drunken thrall could use it, yet so essential that its loss would have spelt a navigation apocalypse. Each time they checked their heading, the needle bobbed, and the navigator would squint through frost-bitten eyelashes, muttering about last summer's relentless sunshine in Hebrides, as if to mock their current plight. Below decks, the cook faced his own battlefield. Rations had dwindled to a brittle loaf of hardtack per man, hard-earned calories that tasted of sawdust and regret. Today's menu expansion featured lukewarm broth made from an ancient hunk of salted bacon, boiled until its fat coagulated into chewy islands. Even the thralls, accustomed to Spartan fare, grew nostalgic for fermented moss soup, rumored to be more palatable than any shipboard concoction. Yet morale hinged on these meager meals. Each swallow warmed damp hands and spirit alike, reinforcing the unspoken resolve to endure. Mid-morning, the ship encountered its first whirl of pack ice. Sheets of ice clacked together like glass knives under the hull, creating a percussion that sounded like the laughter of drowned souls. The crew dropped their oars and leaned on the longship's edges, heaving to let the current sweep them past this natural gauntlet. Every plank groaned, every shield rattled. The captain's bald pate glistened with condensation as he ordered them to listen to the wood. In Norse lore, a ship was alive, and treating her respectfully meant the difference between creak and crack. Coils of rope were freed for a dreaded task, kedging off. The small boat was launched with a pair of oarsmen and a rope-devoted sailor tasked with placing a heavy anchor on the ice floe ahead. Once secured, the crew aboard the Nar hauled on the line, dragging the vessel inch by inch past treacherous ice. The process was backbreaking, mutiny-inducing work, but more tolerable than a hull breach. And so, for hours, every man and woman leaned into the heave, sweat freezing on their brows, cursing the gods and promising them better sacrifices should they survive. By midday, they emerged from the ice, and the navigator announced a turn toward open waters. Relief was fleeting. As the crew stretched aching limbs, dark clouds rolled in, heralding another squall. Within minutes, wind roared like 1,000 wolves, and waves rose like living hills. Sailors scrambled to reef the topsails even as the helmsman struggled to keep the Nar's blunt prow into the gale. The ship pitched so violently that a substitute rowing bench dislodged, crashing into a thrall's head and sending him sprawling into a barrel of salted herring, an event met with stifled snorts from the remainder of the watch. On deck, frost accumulated in crystalline filigrees, each freeze-thaw cycle adding to the weight that threatened to snap rigging lines. The crew coated their woolen gloves with seal oil to prevent sticking, but the oily residue froze into a slick that made climbing the shrouds akin to scaling a greased wall. Hands numbed, sealskin mittens useless. Aged sailors recited snippets of ancient wisdom: wrap your sinews in linen before fur, chew dried wormwood to stave off chills. Each proverb delivered with the gravitas of holy scripture. The ship's carpenter, sinewy and uncomplaining, spent these quieter moments below decks reinforcing crucial beams with spare oak planks. Every nail hammered bore a weighty purpose, reinforcing the very skeleton of their floating world. It was meticulous work, yet essential. A loose rib would let the sea in like an unwanted guest. He worked by lantern light, sweat freezing in tufts on his beard, while the cook lent him broth, thick with the promise of warmth. Their camaraderie, carpenter and cook, builder and brewer, was a small echo of community in an isolated world. Dinner brought a brief reprieve. The cook had managed to salvage a handful of seaweed preserved in tar-lined jars, an acquired taste that many sailors swore bolstered their immune systems. Sliced thin and fried in residual bacon fat, the seaweed resembled kelp chips, and its salty crunch provided a welcome texture to the softness of gruel. The crew passed around mead skins, small portions heated on a hot iron to melt away the chill. Even a sip of warm honeyed brew felt like ambrosia, and glasses were raised to the next sunrise, a collective prayer against eternal night. Night at sea is a choreography of peril and routine. Rotating watches meant no one ever slept more than an hour at a time, and often not even that. Curling up in a corner of the deck, you risked being rolled off by a sudden pitch. Below decks, you risked asphyxiation under an avalanche of barrels. So most sailors leaned against the mast, eyes half closed, dreaming of land while gloves throbbed. Every groan of timber, every slap of wave against hull awakened them, and they would rouse obediently, hoisting sail, bailing water, cursing fellow crewmen under breath that biscuits would crumble rather than break. The mid-watch brought a spectacular sky. Lightning forked across the horizon, illuminating the sea in ghostly blue. Thunder boomed like a celestial war drum, and rain pounded the deck in erratic cadences. Lightning-struck water is no joke. A bolt could stun a man or splice a mast. The crew forced the sail down to a spare, smaller storm sail woven from flax, a last resort canvas that only half fit the yard. It slapped in the wind like a wounded bird, yet held enough to let them steer gently through the tempest. Each man braced himself, both hands gripping whatever rail or rope was nearest, and whispered oaths to Thor to keep the lightning at bay. With dawn's return came exhausted relief. The storm broke, leaving a glassy sea that reflected a bruised sky. The ship floated silently, motionless except for the gentle swell. Wildfowl landed on deck, seeking refuge from the storm's rage, only to be shooed away with charred knitting needles repurposed for bird control. The cook, ever optimistic, snapped a bird's neck and plucked it for tomorrow's stew. The crew gave a sluggish cheer, aware that the seafowl was not an indiscretion, but a necessary addition to their protein tally. The next hours were devoted to repairs and preparations. Sailors replaced broken blocks, greased hinges with rendered fat to ward off freezing, and replaced tattered rope coils. The navigation instruments were scrubbed clean of brine, then wrapped in sealed cloth and stored in the captain's cabin to protect them from further salt damage. Quartermasters inspected stores, salt fare, hardtack dwindling, fresh water still at minimal levels. Discussion arose about limiting non-essential water consumption. Rinse clothes in seawater only, skip the morning rinse of hands, but the captain vetoed extremes. Hygiene, however scant, kept scurvy at bay and spirits afloat. By afternoon, they spotted a distant promontory, a cluster of lichen-covered boulders jutting from the sea. Could it be land? A waypoint carved into the ancient charts? Joy and skepticism warred in every sailor's mind. Approaching cautiously, the lookouts confirmed the sighting, a small islet, likely uninhabited, but offering beachcombing potential for driftwood, stranded kelp, or shellfish. The crew broke into sudden motion. Oars were swung into the water, sails furled, and the longship maneuvered into a lee. The prospect of standing on solid ground after days of topside roll seemed to electrify them more than any lightning storm. Landing on the islet was a careful affair. The shore was jagged, currents swirling in unpredictable eddies. The helmsman nudged the prow into a sheltered cove, while others leapt ashore, anchoring the ship with lines tied to boulders. Feet hit firm rock, and every man let out an involuntary whoop, part relief, part disbelief. The island's sparse vegetation, gooseberries, hardy grass, and barnacles, became instant treasure. The cook gathered what he could, promising a stew that would taste of freedom itself. On land, they salvaged driftwood for repairs, splintered planks from distant shores bleached by sun and salt. These scraps were more precious than gold, destined for emergency hull patches, kindling, or makeshift splints for frostbitten toes. The island's rocky pools yielded shellfish, mussels, and limpets, which the cook roasted over a small beach fire coaxed alive with embers from the hollow gourd. The taste of warm mollusk flesh was almost supernatural, a testament to how little it takes to revive hope when survival teeters on the edge. Equally vital was the chance to empty and refill water skins. The crew scoured rainwater pools, scooped through seaweed for filtration, then boiled the brackish water over driftwood fires. This ritual, dirty, tedious, yet essential, was accompanied by songs of home, lullabies mothers once crooned in sunlit meadows, now sung by ragged voices on a rocky spit in the North Atlantic. Each note carried longing and tenacity, a reminder that even in the face of relentless freezing storms, the human heart clings fiercely to warmth and memory. Their brief island sojourn ended all too soon. With sails patched and water replenished, the ship cast off lines as the tide eased her out. The crew paused at the gunwale to salute their temporary sanctuary, a gesture half superstitious, half gleeful. The navigator reoriented the compass, sighting for the next waypoint marked in runes. Ahead lay uncharted waters, storms yet to test their mettle, and the looming promise of unknown shores. As the Norse slipped from the cove, the men and women on deck felt the dual edges of relief and anticipation. Survival at sea was not a linear narrative of calm after tempest. It was cyclical, a series of brutal tests punctuated by fleeting respites. Each gale, each frozen plank, each mile rowed in sub-zero misery was a stanza in their saga. Yet the human spirit, fueled by blistered hopes and half-frozen dreams, pressed onward, and so they sailed into the gathering dusk, the silhouette of their vessel etched against the twilight. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, ice-churned waters, fierce gales, or perhaps the rewarding sight of farmland waiting to be claimed. For now, they huddled beneath tattered sail, gloves pressed to lips in silent vows, to weather the cold, to mock the gale, to laugh at the absurdity of seeking warmth in a world determined to freeze them. They were Norse seafarers, bound by oaths to adventure and survival, and the sea, vengeful, majestic, unforgiving, was their home. The night watch waned into a prey of pre-dawn gloom when the lookout's cry shattered drowsy reverie. Iceberg dead ahead. In the half-light, the monstrous hulks drifted like pale leviathans, their underbellies slick with slime and ice. The crew tumbled from makeshift hammocks of coil rope and oars, slipping on salt-slick planks as they scrambled to clear sail. No time for dramatic pausing, every second counted. With a single heave of the rudder plank and a chorus of "haul aft," they veered the Nar's prow, letting a dozen oars snatch the hull sideways, just enough to avoid a fatal collision. Once past, hearts pounded like war drums in rib cages. Even the hardened captain exhaled in shock. The iceberg's jagged teeth had missed them by mere inches, close enough to see the shadow of a seal clinging to its surface, blinking at the spectacle as though judging their seaworthiness. The crew offered a muted round of "Skull" to survive yet another brush with death, then set about the immediate task of ripping out soaked furs and wringing them dry by the hearth-gourd heater. The air inside the deckhouse steamed, lending the smell of boiled wool and salt to every cough. Daylight revealed a sea strewn with burgee bits, mini icebergs the size of cottages, requiring constant vigilance. The navigator recalibrated the water needle compass at each watch change, grumbling about the soul stuck in that frozen glacier. He pointed resoundingly toward open water, though the crew suspected he'd only spotted a distant squall that might push them clear of the ice fields. At his word, they sculled into shifting lanes between floes, pulling the Nar inch by inch through a labyrinth of blue-green ice. The hull scraped against hidden edges, each screech a reminder that wood and water mix poorly under pressure. By mid-morning, the wind swung around from the north, ushering in a dank drizzle that stung exposed cheeks like a swarm of freezing needles. The cook, culinary alchemist of the hold, had poured the last of the preserved seaweed into the communal broth, creating a stew so pungent that thralls bandaged their noses with scraps of linen. In contrast, the aroma of heated whale oil lamps offered fleeting comfort, though several sailors swore the lamps were the size of small whales themselves. Conversation revolved around the myth of warmth in a can, the legendary sealed barrels of flaming mead that some coastal clans claimed to carry, an impossible treasure they all yearned to loot. Afternoon brought a different peril, rogue waves. Without warning, a wall of water, half again as tall as the mast, reared up behind them and crashed over the stern. The gale-driven blast swept away shields, drenched the crew in icy brine, and sent a thrall flying into a coil of rope. He emerged later, sputtering and questioning his life choices. Oars snapped like toothpicks in the melee, forcing the ship to drift helplessly as each man clung to the thwarts for dear life. The captain roared commands through clenched teeth, ordering the few intact oars to be thrust into the waves once the spray died down. They rowed as though the very gods pursued them, pumping salt water out of the bilge and their lungs in tandem. When the tempest finally exhausted itself, the Nar rode the lull like a wounded beast. Shivering women and men huddled around the meager gourd fire, passing around skins of tepid mead that had been medicinally warmed against the hull. The fire's glow revealed faces carved by wind and salt, lips blue, eyes wild with the promise of spring that still felt a lifetime away. The skald, sensing the weight of the moment, cleared his throat and recited an impromptu verse. "O sea, you ravenous maw of foam, you promise land but offer grave. Yet still we dance upon your bones, frore of flesh but undismayed." The words landed like a blessing, knitting camaraderie in exposed hearts. They laughed, tense, rattling laughs that defied the perils they'd survived. For a heartbeat, the Nar felt less like a coffin and more like a cradle of defiance. That evening, the wind died to a mournful whisper, and the crew sighted a distant light, the beacon of a coastal fire. Landfall meant fresh water, wood for repairs, and a chance to stretch numb limbs on solid ground. As they steered toward the glow, the navigator cautioned against celebrating too soon. The shore could be a rocky trap hidden by wind-blown mist. Sure enough, the first glimpses of land were jagged black cliffs with no inlet in sight. The light burned atop a lonely cairn, likely a votive fire built by monks as much to guide as to ward off raiders. The crew sighed collectively, a safe haven within reach, encircled by reefs and currents that would test every ounce of their seamanship. Dawn's pale fingers found the Nar, grounded in a shallow bay, its keel lodged in sand and seaweed. They had run aground at slack tide. The ship listed gently as the water fell away. No breaking wave shattered the hull, but the groan of timber against sand echoed across the still morning. A landing party, armed with mallets, improvised levers, and bucketfuls of sweat, set to work. They built temporary braces under the keel, then waited for the tide's return to lift the vessel. While they waited, others ventured ashore, gathering driftwood and felling small pines for fresh caulking. The sight of needles, pine cones, and soft earth beneath boots was surreal, an intoxicating respite from the endless churn of brine and plank. At high tide, the Nar floated free, her hull scrubbed gently by the returning sea. The crew cheered as if birthing a foal. The captain allowed himself a rare grin. Repairs commenced immediately. Cracked planks were replaced, seams recaulked with fresh pine tar, and the broken rudder lashings were rewoven by skilled hands. The carpenter's apprentice, once a thrall, now had standing permission to use the captain's carving knife. He carved a small star into the new planking, a silent sigil of survival that no storm could erase. That night on shore, the entire crew feasted on shellfish, mussels, limpets, and crabs, and boiled seaweed cakes fried in seal fat. The cook even managed to bake a flatbread from leftover ship's biscuit crumbs, pounded fine and mixed with fresh spring water. It emerged charred at the edges, but warm and tear-inducing in its simplicity. Sated, they sat around the cairn fire, trading stories of sea serpents glimpsed through storm clouds and mermaid songs carried on the wind. Each tale grew wilder than the last. One seaman swore he had hooked an 8-headed eel. Another claimed he heard drowned oars singing a dirge beneath his hull. The legend stitched hope into the night air, stitching hearts tighter than any rope. By moonrise, the shore breeze had grown chilly. The crew, knowing the Nar needed fresh water and firewood again, prepared to return. They hauled the ship into the shallows, squeezed onto deck with their new supplies, and with a collective heave, shoved off from land. The push felt anticlimactic compared to their previous struggles, yet just as vital. The cargo hold bore fresh barrels of water. The deck boasted bundles of pine logs wrapped in sailcloth, and every sailor carried a fistful of dried herbs, heather, sage, and juniper, to mask the stench of sea spray and sleeping bodies. Under a blanket of stars, the Nar slipped back into the waiting arms of the ocean. The fresh provisions brought a buzz of energy. Bailing felt less like torture, sails less like shrouds. The next challenge lay the southwest. Rumored isles brimming with timber, meadows, and possibly a Norse settlement eager for trade. But first they faced a night watch, 2 hours on, 2 off, cycling through cold, dark, and damp. The deck grew slick under dew and salt. Oars were stowed, sails furled to whisper thin stripes, and the helmsman, eyes half-lidded, held the rudder steady toward the stars. Mid-watch, the sea's mirror shattered as phosphorescent plankton bloomed beneath the hull, ghostly lights trailing in the ship's wake. The phenomenon was both beautiful and eerie. Tiny starbursts pulsed underfoot, as if the ocean celebrated their passage before dragging them back into its depths. Sailors paused to marvel, letting the night's hush wash over them. The skald wrote new verses in his head. When night's black cloak is pierced below, let light of ocean guide us home. With that spark of wonder lighting frozen spirits, they pressed on into the deep. Ahead lay trials unimagined, hurricane-force gusts, whirlpools born of hidden currents, and the constant gnaw of cold that seeped into bone and heart. Yet they sailed on, woven together by shared frostbite and laughter, by near escapes and makeshift feasts, by the stubborn conviction that no sea, no storm, could extinguish the flame of human will. As dawn's first pale glow shimmered on the restless sea, the Nar sliced through gentle swells toward the promise of fertile isles. The crew, lean from salt and storm, peered toward a horizon that blossomed with rocky promontories and highland grasses faintly green beneath snowdrifts. Their hearts quickened at the sight of land. With it, fresh pasture for their beasts, timber for ship repairs, and the possibility of sheltered coves to weather the next gale. By mid-morning, they were picking their way through a narrow channel guarded by jagged reefs. The helmsman, voice hoarse from wind and brine, guided the vessel with the precision of a surgeon, each adjustment the difference between safe anchorage and a shipwrecked grave. As they crossed the threshold into the cove, waves softened to a lullaby, and the pounding of their hearts gave way to the crisp crackle of shoreline surf. Leaping ashore, the crew breathed air untainted by salt spray and wood smoke. They collapsed on mossy stones, stretching limbs that had forgotten the luxury of straightening back to full height. The cook scrambled to build a fire from driftwood, and soon the sweet, resinous smoke curled above them, its warmth wrapping around shoulders tighter than any cloak. A pot of thin stew bubbled over coals. Reconstituted meat pucks, dried berries, and nettle greens plucked from craggy ground, flavored with a handful of herbs the navigator had tucked into his pack weeks before. While the thralls foraged for edible roots and fresh water, the ship's carpenter and a pair of willing seamen hauled timber from the strand. They carved new planks to replace battered hull boards and hewed stout spars to mend tattered yards. Under the pale sun, the wood sang as their axes bit into it, each chip a note in the melody of renewal. The navigator paced the beach, sketching contours in sand and marking safe passage for future voyages. His eyes, once dull with cold, now shone with purpose. They would chart these isles, leaving rune-bound cairns as waypoints for other seafarers. That afternoon, the first of the island's living treasure emerged, hardy sheep that wandered down to the water's edge, their thick fleeces shedding snow like ripe pomegranates scattering seeds. The crew approached in cautious greeting. Wolves might lurk behind unseen ridges, and sheep could turn on strangers when cornered. Yet these creatures, more curious than frightened, allowed themselves to be corralled into makeshift pens. Soon, fresh wool was clipped and woven into earmuffs and gloves, a luxury after months of damp sealskins and crusted furs. Mothers at sea are patient spinners, and by nightfall, enough yarn had been twisted into practical mittens to outfit half the crew. In the gathering dusk, tents were pitched on a sheltered shelf above the cove. Inside, the Skald took up his lyre, singing of their journey, of iceberg grazes, gale-lashed decks, and midnight storms that had tested sinew and spirit alike. His verses wove humor into hardship, how Olaf had tried to patch a leak with his own hat, only to lose it to the sea, how Ingrid had sewn a new sail with the errant fingers of Frostbite, how Eric's beard had frozen into icicles that chimed like tiny bells when he spoke. Laughter rippled among the tired souls, lightening burdens they had carried for leagues across the merciless ocean. Long into the night, watch rotations continued even on solid ground. Moonlight painted the snow-tipped hills silver, and every so often the shore licked the hearth's warmth, sending embers spiraling skyward like sparks from a giant's forge. The cook, emboldened by newfound supplies, roasted fresh lamb over an open spit, basting it with seal fat and herb-infused oil. The first juices to flow were savored in solemn silence, so rich, so succulent that each bite felt like reclaiming a part of their stolen humanity. They slept in thin shifts. The captain and navigator maintained vigil by the cairns, ensuring the rune-marked stones remained visible under drifting snow. Their prayer was simple, that these friendly isles would shelter them through the final storms of the season, that this moment of reprieve would carry them all safely home. Elsewhere, thralls huddled near the fires, sharing stories of loved ones waiting in distant homesteads, wives cradling newborns, fathers charting overdue returns, children dreaming of pirate lore and hero couples. As morning broke again, the Nar lay dry-docked on the beach, a testament to their seamanship. The tide's return would float her for the next leg of the voyage. Until then, crews polished hull planks, scrubbed lockers of brine, and oiled moving parts to keep them from seizing in frost. The navigator carved a new masthead figure, a sea serpent biting its own tail, promising safe passage around unknown shoals. A thrall painted it in bold strokes, each pigment mixed from crushed berries and charcoal, a vivid emblem against pale wood. Their final feast on the isle was a celebration of contrasts, steaming bowls of nettle and mutton stew, crisp lamb roast, shells of charred seaweed, sweet root preserves, and horns of honeyed mead warmed over coals. They dined under cloudless skies, the Milky Way arching overhead like a Valkyrie's shield, guiding them onward. Toasts rang to each other's health, to the gods who had spared them, to the sea that both nourished and threatened. In that moment, they were more than travelers. They were survivors, storytellers, weavers of sagas that would echo through halls long after the timber had rotted and the iron had rusted. And yet, as they broke a camp and reboarded the Nar, a hush fell. The sea awaited, unchanged in its indifference. Waves lapped the prow, inviting them back into its cold embrace. The crew tightened their leather straps, donned their new woolens, and with hands freshly blistered from unloading supplies, cast off ropes with a collective heave. The Nar swayed gently, laden now with fresh timber, sheepskin bundles, and hearts fortified by laughter and lamp. The first strokes of the oars were slow, deliberate, muscles remembering both misery and triumph. They steered north toward the long journey home, each pull on the oar a promise to those they loved. We endure. As the isle receded into mist, the navigator unfurled his map, tracing the route that would reunite crew and kin. Ahead lay more trials, winter storms that still churned unseen, seas that would test them again. But now they carried with them the memory of warmth on rock and the taste of victory baked in smoke. In the days that followed, their story became legend. Seafarers who had survived freezing storms by grit and guile, who had coaxed warmth from wood, wool, and wit, who had transformed terror into camaraderie and cold into tales by the hearth. For every gale they rode, every iceberg they skirted, every scrap of loom-spun wool they wore, they honored the absurd absurdity of risking life on the high seas, and the even greater absurdity of savoring a feast in a world determined to freeze them. When at last their home harbor came into view, smoke curling from stone chimneys, banners snapping in gentler breezes, the crew broke into a final chorus of songs. Children ran to the docks, mothers waved torn cloths, and dogs barked against a backdrop of rolling hills. The Nar nudged against the quay, and one by one, seafarers stepped ashore, ankles weak from oar-wrenching toil, faces flushed with salt and triumph. They embraced loved ones, their words lost in the tumult of joy and relief, but their eyes spoke clearly. We survived. Picture your fingers turning into icicles mid-swing as you raise your axe against the dawn's pale light, every nerve screaming that frostbite has claimed your fingertips, but you still have to loot that monastery before breakfast. Welcome to winter raids, Norse style. They called it the Frost War, though there was nothing civil about it. Imagine a dark dawn in January, when the horizon is a slash wound of gray, and the only warmth comes from your own ragged breath. A dozen warriors stand on the deck of a Nar, feet clad in sodden sealskin boots, breath icing on their beards. They're about to storm a coastal village 2 days' march from home. A quick hit, they tell themselves, before the cold gnaws their joints into useless stumps. But winter raids weren't quick, and frostbite wasn't polite. Long before the shoreline hove into view, preparations began. No modern Gore-Tex here. Warriors layered linen tunics under woolen cloaks, then wrapped hide leggings around their calves, secured with cords so tight they'd later blur circulation into numb oblivion. Heads were tucked beneath wool hats lined with animal fur, ear flaps dangling like furry regrets. Bodies were greased with a mixture of bear fat and pine resin, a primitive moisturizer meant to seal out windburn, but smelling like campfire shampoo. Every exposed inch of skin was slathered. Every warrior carried a flask of mead and another of hot broth, both stored in leather skins that sweat in the cold. On the eve of departure, the chieftain's hall echoed with grim jokes. "May your ears freeze before you lose them, Kjetil," one berserker cackled. "And may your toe fall off before someone steals your shield," retorted another. The humor was gallows-like but vital. Laughter staved off panic. Mothers and wives pressed woolen mittens and small flasks of warmed spiced wine into departing hands, tears glinting like frozen dew. The warriors exchanged vows of vengeance and questionable hygiene, promising to wed only after they'd plundered enough silver to pay for new beards. By first light, the longship sliced through icy waters toward a jagged coast. Every wave sprayed salt-laced chill across the deck, coating shields and oars in brittle permafrost. Hands went numb in seconds. Leather gloves stiffened into shards that cut as they gripped rope. On cue, the berserkers broke into a war chant, raw, unmelodic howls that echoed off frozen cliffs. The noise was less for intimidation than to warm their lungs, a chorus of forced breath that felt like gargling glass. Landing required more cunning than brute strength. They beached the Gnar on a strip of cobbled shore, half hidden by snowdrifts, then dragged it into a shallow fjord arm. Warriors formed a human chain to pass axes, shields, and small packs ashore. Each footstep crunched through ice, punctuated by the hiss of melting threads as steel blades cut through frozen cords. A slip meant your leg went through a hidden ice hole, anything to avoid that. Once off the beach, the raiding party huddled behind a ridge of frost-edged boulders. A scouting trio, faces obscured by fur masks, crept forward. Their mission, mark enemy positions with runic chalk so the main force needn't freeze while guessing. The cold turned breath to fog and skin to porcelain. Scouting meant daring the wind to strip your sense of touch. If a sentinel spotted them, the raid risked turning into a desperate battle against villagers wielding pitchforks and torches, anything to fend off these frost-ridden invaders. Back at the ridge, the chieftain surveyed the village, half-buried wooden huts, smoke spiraling from chimneys into steel skies. Sentinels patrolled a palisade, breath like mini gargoyles hovering above their heads. The order came, move at once. Warriors raised their axes, iron crescents dulled by salt corrosion, and advanced over crunchy snow. Each step was agony, boots grinding into packed ice, knees buckling under layered clothing that rubbed and chafed raw skin. As they neared the palisade, Frostbite began its work. Fingers lost feeling before eyes could focus, numbness spreading like a dark tide from fingertips to wrists. Warriors forced themselves to grip weapons, metal hilts so cold they burned. Their breaths were ragged coughs of ice shards. Sweat froze in their layers, creating an armor of frozen cloth that cracked with every movement. The first clash was brutal. Raiders surged over the palisade in a phalanx of frost-stained furs and snarling faces. Villagers fought back with torches, clubs, and spilled boiling porridge, anything to stop the Norse onslaught. The fight was close quarter, metal ringing, wood splintering, sparks igniting powdered snow into brief, cold flares. Each warrior moved between two worlds, the need to fell an enemy before pain consumed them, and the dread that Frostbite would claim their weapon hand mid-swing, leaving them a walking corpse. In the lull between battles, the chieftain shouted commands to retreat for field dressings. A cluster of wounded lay huddled in a snow-chilled lean-to, their blood steaming on contact with the air. Healers, thralls pressed into service, unwrapped saturated gauze and removed frozen flesh from weapon wounds. Alcohol tinctures were in short supply. They improvised with boiled nettle tea boiled down to a stinging concentrate. Patients screamed as the brew touched open skin, tears freezing on cheeks. Yet few complained. Frostbite felt like a million needles, a firestorm beneath the skin. Off to one side, a warrior named Hala arranged her reindeer fur mittens around a small brazier. She drilled holes in a hollowed gourd to create a makeshift hand warmer, blackened by soot but precious beyond measure. Each warrior who passed took turns pressing frost-numb fingers against the bruised metal, cursing as warmth crept back. It was a ritual. Pass the brazier, share a grunt, steel yourself for the next strike. By midday, the villagers' resistance collapsed into frightened flight. Raiders poured through open doors, scooping up hams of salted pork, lengths of tallow candle, and slabs of cold smoked fish. Hauls were loaded onto sleds improvised from crates and shields. Victory tasted of smoked meat and bile, spiced with the vulnerability of being far from home and far from warmth. But the triumph was Pyrrhic. As the raiding party retraced its steps to the beach, the wind had picked up. A gale roared down the fjord, carrying needles of snow that sliced exposed skin. Every face was a mask of frost, beards crusted, eyelashes iced. Hammers of pain struck at ears, cheeks, and noses. Throat muscles seized as frozen condiments adhered to the windpipe, making every breath a labor. A warrior noticed his toes were leaden weights, boots transformed into blocks of ice. He tried to remove his boot to rub life back, but Frostbite's trick was that it numbed your senses. He could barely feel the cold, only wonder why his toes had vanished. Panic flickered beneath his ribs until his companion slapped him back to sense. Save thoughts of amputations for later. We're not letting the tide take you too. They reached the longship, breathless and staggering. Raiders loaded their booty into the hold, heaving heavy baskets of salted goods that would later trade for silver. No one cared about the loot's value. It was a proof that they had fought and conquered winter's fury. But the real prize was getting below deck, where the cook had stoked a small charcoal brazier beneath an iron griddle. He slid out a tray of scalding oatcakes, gray slabs that broke teeth but promised warmth. Warriors huddled around the heat, pressing their backs to the hull's interior, sharing bowls of lukewarm broth spiced with juniper berries. Every spoonful burned down throats as if swallowing shards of flame. Conversation with stilted gurgles of relief. My fingers thawed, sort of. Is that porridge or wood pulp? If I survive, remind me never to raid in January again. Laughter was brittle but genuine, microbursts of warmth against a sea of ice. Below decks, Frostbite's aftermath surfaced. Several warriors peeled off frozen mittens, exposing mottled gray flesh that peeled like scaly parchment. Some wept quietly, others bit back curses. Thralls boiled water in iron pots, and one by one warriors dunked frostbitten hands into tepid baths. The relief was immediate but temporary. Pain erupted as circulation returned, a wave of agony that left them gasping. Bandages went on soaked in boiled spruce resin, a primitive antiseptic, and fingers were bound in layers of wool strips. Illness followed close behind. The body's weakened state made chilblains spread from extremities into joints, and a cruel cough began its rounds, a rasping hack that sounded like ragged sails in a gale. One veteran warrior, proud and silent, collapsed with fever shakes. He was laid on a bed of furs near the brazier. Thralls shared their own wool socks and warmed bottles pressed to his chest. He whispered apologies for being a burden, then coughed up blood-streaked phlegm that hissed on the embers. The chieftain convened a war council. Rumor had it the target village lay deeper inland, with churches full of silver. But winter had already claimed half their strength. Frostbitten hands and feet, a growing fever epidemic, and the gnaw of hunger beyond salted fish. The decision was swift: retreat. No raid was worth a graveyard of frostbitten skeletons. So the withdrawal began. Raiders dragged sleds laden with booty, forming single-file lines through knee-deep snow. The wind conspired, driving sleet into faces like a whiteout gauntlet. Leaders called cadence, 1-2, 1-2. A faint echo of war chant turned murder by cold. When a warrior stumbled, he was hoisted back, blankets draped over shoulders. Footsteps sank into snow, leaving a record of agony, prints half formed, then a sharp break where a foot slipped from a numb leg. At last, the longship's runners gleamed through the snow. The beached Nar awaited like a skeleton of wood and iron. Soldiers heaved the hull free, slid aboard, and dropped into seats behind oars. For a moment, the discipline of rowing replaced panic. Oars dipped in unison, strokes slow but resolute. The ship cleaved the fjord's mirror, sending shards of ice skittering away in its wake. Below deck, warmth increased. The cook ladled out hot broth thickened with oatmeal. Thralls passed around a precious horn of spiced mead. Warriors sipped, eyes glazed with exhaustion and relief. Words came more easily now. "We'll live," one murmured, voice raw. "Barely," another agreed, raising his cup in a crooked salute. Frostbite would cost some fingers, perhaps toes, and winter cough would linger like a phantom. But they had stormed a village in the dead of frost, looted its stores, and returned to their ship. They had mocked winter's bite and survived its sting. In the sagas they would be called heroes. In memory, they would recall the smell of pine resin, the taste of juniper broth, the sound of crackling furs. Yet most of all, they would remember the sharp lesson of frost, that winter raids were not glories but curses to be sung of with ironic laughter by hearth fires far from the frozen north. By the time the sun slumped low on the horizon, the raiding party had covered nearly half their return march, and discovered that Frostbite wasn't satisfied with hands and feet alone. It had climbed into muscle, seeped into joints, and lodged in lungs like an unwelcome house guest. So Part 2 opens on a battleground of survival protocols, bitter improvisations, and absurd remedies no medic would endorse today. The column paused beneath a stand of barren pines. Warriors huddled in little knots of misery, hunching shoulders against wind that felt like needles in their lungs. Frost giants, they joked grimly, had sharpened every branch. The chieftain, still hale enough to bark orders, summoned his healers, thralls with dubious credentials and questionable hygiene. Their first task, prevent gangrene. Every warrior sat on a rough-hewn stump, while thralls unpacked leather satchels of boiled water, dried nettles, and smoldering coals. The process began with frostbite warming rituals. No slow rewarming here. That invited tissue death. Instead, thralls plunged frost-numb fingers into jars of steaming nettle decoction, forcing circulation like medieval pinball. The sting was electric. Warriors howled into their furs as pain ricocheted through frozen limbs. Then came the coal therapy, placing heated stones wrapped in cloth against frostbitten calves and forearms. The stones hissed as their heat met lingering ice. Skin crackled and peeled, but circulation leapt back like a startled wolf. Thralls massaged the thawed flesh with a paste of bear fat and crushed juniper berries, believed to ward off infection and hopefully searing odors of rot. Meanwhile, coughs had become the new war chant. Warriors hacked through nights, their chests rattling like unstrung lyres. One veteran, Bjorn Iron Lungs Haraldsson, offered the first cough remedy. Cut a hunk of reindeer lichen from a tree branch, grind it into powder, and inhale through bent reed. Supposedly, the lichen's spores acted as a primitive antibiotic, though it tasted like snorting dust. Doubters sneezed themselves into paroxysms, but some claimed relief, forging folk faith in the mud-covered fungus. The column reassembled, their gait uneven, hobbling on bandaged feet and gripping bleeding digits. The chieftain wheeled his horse into their midst, distributing flasks of mead warmed with cloves and a pinch of crushed birch bark. "Medicine," he declared. The spiced mead scalded throats, uncoiling lungs like iron springs. Silence fell as each warrior swallowed. Eyes closed, hands clutching stomachs against revolt. A pause, then grunts of approval. If nothing else, the sacrament buzzed the brain enough to dull awareness of raw flesh. Nightfall found them in an abandoned shepherd's hut, a dank stone refuge spiffed up with fresh pine boughs on the floor. Inside, the cook wrestled his fine-brained meal. Barley porridge enriched with rendered goose fat and tiny sprigs of wild thyme. It was mush, yes, but edible, dripping with grease that adhered to throat lining like a winter coat. Each spoonful felt like swallowing a glowing ember. Warriors gathered around the hearth, elbows touching in cramped heat, sharing bowls and stories. My toes gone numb again. Don't tell my wife I lost 2 eyebrows in a gale. Next raid, remind me to pack wool socks, not moss. Healers used the same hearth to concoct salves. They boiled small fish livers in goat milk, then strained the mixture into muddy-looking ointment. Highly nutritious, one thrall insisted, slathering it onto open sores, like eating cod without chewing. Victims of the cure hissed and spat, blinking through steaming ointment, but infection receded, likely because the cold itself deterred bacteria. They slept on opposite corners of the hut, dreaming of warmth and cursing frost giants for choosing northern Europe as their hunting grounds. Dawn required a painful rally. Warriors emerged bleary-eyed, faces stiff from sleeping on boughs. The cook insisted on a warm-up routine. Slow lunges over a smoldering ember tray, aiming to coax blood from frozen limbs. They stretched like aging gnolls, howling encouragement or curses at creaking joints. One robust thrall timed 10 deep breaths of steam from a boiling kettle, while another forced every warrior to inhale through a spoonful of hot berry compote, a sugar hit to stave off shivering chills. The march resumed, snow crunching under boots. The battered cohort advanced through pine forest skeletal with winter's hold. Now came the trick of keeping boots dry. Warriors wrapped feet in layers of treated hides, then enveloped them in linen strips soaked in pine tar. When the tar dried, it formed a brittle shell sealing out moisture. Boots still soaked, but not as fast. Some wrapped hides in animal bladder, primitive waterproofing that squeaked like wet leather, but worked. As rain and sleet drifted down, they trudged on, ignoring slush seeping into raw flesh because survival demanded such heroics. As they crested a frozen stream, the navigator halted them again. He held up a twig from alder wood, gripped at both ends and twisted until it broke. The straight break, he professed, indicated a change in barometric pressure. An incoming storm, he warned. One sharper than the one that drove them here. Warriors groaned. Storm or no, they had to cross. They formed a human bridge. Each man linked arms, forming a chain across the ice. One by one, warriors trod carefully across, distributing weight. The chain held until the last man reached the opposite bank. Then they hurled off the chain. No one fell in. A victory dance ensued, brief, tipsy, uncoordinated. Midday hunger pangs prodded them toward a cluster of birch trees. The cook, resourceful as ever, experimented with birch sap broth, drilling tiny holes in tree trunks, collecting sap in moss-lined baskets, then boiling it down with herbs. The result, a thin, slightly sweet liquid that, bless its heart, warmed slightly after 3 minutes of roasting over coals. Warriors sipped, claiming it was better than nothing, which, by common consensus, meant barely palatable but prevents starvation. Illness lurked not just in frostbite but in scurvy. Scurvy's creeping paralysis showed itself in bleeding gums and aching joints. One healer, recalling an old saga, recommended chewing on dried berries of mountain ash. They contained vitamin C, however minimal. Thralls gathered what little they found, crushing berries into a gritty paste mixed with honey. Each warrior popped a small spoonful daily, wincing at the bitterness. Gum bleeding slowed marginally, fueling belief in the remedy. It didn't cure scurvy completely, but enough that they didn't keel over before reaching home. Afternoon brought a short respite beside a frozen lake. Warriors collapsed on the ice, sun slanting through cloud cover and glinting off frozen surface like shards of glass. The cook laid out the boiled fish jerky they'd looted, tough as boot leather, but oily and chewy. The junk food jamboree kicked off with loud chewing and no small measure of ironic pride. Remember the monastery's fish fats? Now it's fueling the return trip. Slurping bone fragments in every lump of jerky, they chewed while swapping stories of bleaching a leather wall hanging by rubbing salt into its strands, an unintended byproduct of raiding that had created Viking. Abstract art. As shadows lengthened, they stumbled upon an old hermitage nestled in a stand of scrubby juniper. The hermit, a gaunt ascetic prone to coughing fits, invited them inside his single-room cell, warmed by a tiny peat fire. He offered them tea brewed from dried willow bark, an analgesic prized in monastic circles. Warriors grumbled but drank. The tea's bitter tannins stung throats, but eased their coughs and warmed their interiors. In exchange, the chieftain left a small pouch of silver pennies and a clipped hide cloak, along with a sheepishly carved bit of stave poetry praising the hermit's tolerance. Refreshed, they resumed the march under a sky bleeding into dusk. Their progress slowed as darkness crept in, and the cook issued a final ration of spice cakes, dense discs of barley meal, honey, and crushed ginger. The ginger was an odd luxury, traded from far-off Moslem markets, but its heat rekindled circulation. Warriors gnawed at the cakes by lantern light, lips sticky, hearts briefly buoyed by irrational warmth. Night fell absolute, prompting the chieftain to order a bivouac behind a frozen waterfall acting as a windbreak. They pitched small tents huddled inside layers of furs and gathered around a central brazier fueled by driftwood. No sleeping bags existed. They lay on top of pine boughs, layers of trade blankets, and anything soft they could muster. The dull roar of frozen water provided an oddly soothing soundtrack to their unrest. Inside the largest tent, the chieftain held court. He listened as healers reported progress, Bjorn's cough easing, Hala's toes thawing, some hands still mottled but alive. He acknowledged the cost. We went out as warriors, not pilgrims. Our bodies bear scars the sagas will not record, but the village's silver fills our holds, and our blades remain sharp. Winter's teeth reached for us and missed. The warriors cheered, half-heartedly, half incredulously, because their bodies felt more like riddled fortresses than triumphant battlegrounds. Sleep came in fitful bursts, nightmares of toes turning to shards of ice, of unending marches through endless drifts, but at least the nightmares were less painful than reality. As the watch changed every 2 hours, Warriors stiffly rose to stir embers, sip lukewarm broth, and trade more ginger cakes. Conversation thinned to muffled breathing and the occasional groan. When dawn cracked open the sky, they faced their final day's march toward home. The cook packed away the last of the spice cakes, the healers bundled bandages around each frost-wounded limb, and the navigator pointed them east, toward familiar forests and distant smoke signals atop the motherland's hills. Each step carried them closer to hearth fires, hot baths, and the promise of medicinal baths and boiled herbs. And yet, every man and woman knew the truth. Winter raids marked them. They would return home different, fingers missing, lungs scarred, memories sharpened by pain. The silver they carried would fund future feasts, but no coin could buy back warmth lost, nor remove the taste of bare fat salve from scarred flesh. So they marched on, hobbling through what remained of the frost-bound forest, stave lines graven into trees marking their passage. The sight of a distant homestead on a gentle hill was almost blinding. Smoke curling, dogs barking, women at windows wrapped in wool. Their hearts surged with relief. A final push brought them to the moat-lined yard of their lord. Gates swung open as the chieftain blew on his horn. A war call turned homecoming song. The warriors filtered inside, greeted by roaring fires and steaming cauldrons. Warm water awaited in wooden tubs. Wives and mothers pressed towels to bruised faces. Children stared in awe at their parents' frost-rimed hair and ragged furs. The chieftain raised his voice. "We've plundered far and weathered worse, yet we stand. Let this hall ring with tales of winter raids and Frostbite's folly." They cheered, staggering toward the hearth. Later, the meat boiled in vats of onion and thyme. The mead flowed freely, and the healers brewed sweet-smelling potions from rose hips and chamomile to soothe coughs. Laughter returned, louder, richer, for having tasted the seam of despair and clawed back. They awoke to a hall humming with morning activity, the echo of pots clinking, the creak of benches under cooking kettles, the murmur of hearthside chatter. For many Norse warriors, this was uncharted territory, solid ground underfoot instead of ice-slick deck planks, the smell of onions rather than brine, and faces that greeted them with relief instead of the wind's cruel grin. Yet the frostbitten ones moved slowly, as though the cold still clung to their bones, reminding them that winter's grip did not release easily. First came the Wellness Council, the chieftain, the ship's healers, now upgraded to full-time war surgeons of sorts, and visiting skalds who chronicled the saga in rhyme. Each frost-scarred warrior presented in turn. They reported ongoing symptoms, throbbing stumps where fingers had been lost, blackened toes stiff as wood, coughs that rattled like loose loom beams. The healers listened, nodding gravely, and dispensed advice that ranged from practical to preposterous. "Walk barefoot on warm sand," one recommended, to coax out the cold. Another swore by numbing your mind with mead, a prescription eagerly embraced. But first came the amputation rites. Those whose fingers had turned against them, gangrenous flags on noble hands, sat in a dais of furs before the roaring hearth. The surgeons explained each step, warmed iron shears to sterilize blades, boiled water to clean wounds, and pungent herb poultices of yarrow and plantain to staunch bleeding. Warriors volunteered bravely, spurred by the promise of a swifter recovery. One by one, they gripped leather-bound handles, teeth clenched as their comrades chanted battle hymns. Flesh parted with a wet pop, an instant of stunned silence followed by a roar of approval. Victory over the frozen enemy within their bodies. Blood still wet on the hall floor, the newly maimed stepped forward to receive symbolic tokens. A leather gauntlet carved from a defeated foe's shield, a short dagger etched with their family rune, and a tiny sheaf of protective runes on parchment. These tokens were reminders that no frostbite could steal their honor, and that every severed digit was worth the survival they'd gained. Next came the long convalescence. Warriors withdrew to chambers off the hall, where thralls tended to them like brood hens. These chambers were stocked with steaming tubs of water, infused with juniper tips and crushed elderflowers, an aromatic soak meant to draw out the chill. The process was torturous pleasure, limbs submerged in scalding liquid, skin reddening then easing into pliant warmth. Sinews ached as they stretched and flexed, reawakening muscles that frost had paralyzed. Thralls applied layers of goatskin poultices soaked in salted pork drippings and sheep's wool insulation. They called it fur therapy, and while it smelled faintly of rancid lard, it worked to keep the healing areas from resealing to ice. Meals during recovery were equally strategic. The cook, having drunk deeply from the cup of medicinal cooking, prepared iron-rich broths of nettles and blood sausage to replenish lost vigor. He also crafted healer's cakes, dense loaves of barley meal, honey, and crushed eggshell powder, a primitive form of calcium supplement. Warriors gnawed at them like dog biscuits, but applauded the strength they felt returning to their bones. For the more seasick among them, there was drunken porridge, oatmeal stirred with a splash of mead and a pinch of juniper bark, the sweetness masking the grit of ancient grains. While bodies healed, minds needed tending. Some warriors suffered vivid nightmares, their stumps morphing into serpent heads, coughs turning into the roar of a dragon's throat. The Skald led group recitals of healing sagas, tales of Sigurd forging boneless flesh with dragon's blood, or of Helga the Wise weaving frost-warding spells with only her tongue. These stories offered psychological salve. If heroes of old had bested greater odds, they too could shrug off the mental scars of frost and fever. In the courtyard, training resumed, but modified for the frost-wounded. The foot soldiers who'd lost toes practiced walking drills on uneven stones, barefoot if they had to restore balance. Their gaits were halting at first, but soon they adopted a deliberate swagger, each step a claim that winter would not hobble them forever. Archers with wounded hands adapted by using wider leather straps on their bows, gripping in new positions. Some invented two-handed grips that let them draw arrows despite missing phalanges. They teased each other mercilessly. "Careful, gunner, don't shoot your own stump off." But beneath the banter lay genuine admiration for each other's resilience. A new class of frost scouts emerged, warriors who specialized in winter combat tactics. They learned to sound ice for hidden waterholes, to read snow patterns that revealed wind direction, and to fashion bone needles for stitching torn furs without exposing flesh. They practiced silent march techniques, placing snowshoes made of saplings and rawhide under their boots to move without crunchy betrayal. Their motto, "He who masters snow masters the raiding ground." These scouts would be the envy of every clan when spring came and raiding season beckoned once more. Meanwhile, the pageantry of the post-raid feast honored those who'd returned. A massive long table ran the length of the hall, piled with roast boar, honey-glazed turnips, and barrels of spiced wine. At the head sat the chieftain, his own cloak stitched from wolf pelts salvaged during the raid. He raised a horn of mead to those who endured the frost and refused to die. "May your scars remind you that winter bows to no man, but neither do we." The hall exploded in cheering, cups clattering, and a shred of heat burned in every warrior's chest, hotter than any brazier. Amid the revelry, a curious ritual unfolded: the frog dance. Warriors mimicked frogs emerging from winter slumber, knees bent, arms folded, heads bobbing, hopping across the floor in a mock parade. Each hop represented a frostbite wound healed, a cough subdued, or a panic overcome. The absurdity of grown men in chainmail and ragged furs leaping like amphibians delighted the young and old alike, a jolt of levity after weeks of grim necessity. Beyond the hall, the chieftain ordered a grand project, the Frost Memorial Cairn. Villagers and warriors carried stones marked with runes into the glade outside the settlement. Each stone bore a name and a brief epithet: Kjell, Lost Thumb, Saved All; Halla, Frost Slayer; Bjorn, Cough Wrangler. They stacked the stones into a low tumulus, a permanent testament to winter's cruelty and their own survival. On each naming day thereafter, clansfolk would add sprigs of evergreen to the cairn, renewing vows to remember both the hardship and the triumph. In subsequent weeks, the healers compiled their remedies into a leather-bound tome, the Cold Codex. It detailed recipes for salves, poultices, broths, and teas, techniques for gradual limb warming, and early surgical protocols for frost-numb amputations. The tome circulated among allied clans, improving winter survival across the North Sea world. Its pages were fragrant with remnants of pine tar and elderflower, a tangible legacy of the raid that became a turning point in medical lore. As spring thawed the highlands, the warriors returned to the shore for the next expedition, but changed. Stumps were bandaged, coughs largely banished, and gait tutorials all but forgotten. They moved with the self-assurance of veterans who'd stared down death in the form of frostbite and fever, and won. Shields gleamed in the sunlight, axes swung with renewed vigor, and the wind that once cut through the layers of cloth now felt like a familiar companion, one they understood and respected. When they landed on distant shores again, they found themselves less vulnerable to the cold that had once been their undoing. They built field shelters lined with woven mats of birch bark and thistledown, lit braziers fueled by driftwood and spruce resin, and used simple windbreak trenches that trapped heat around their encampments. On winter raids thereafter, they fared better, still wary of frost's bite, but armed with centuries of distilled knowledge on how to survive it. And so the saga of frostbitten Norse warriors evolved from a tale of near death to a legend of triumph. Their scars, both physical and mental, became badges of honor. Their recipes and rituals spread across fjords and byways, inspiring other seafarers to raid even in midwinter's deadliest months. The wisdom gleaned from frostbite's sting became a cornerstone of Norse resilience, proof that no storm, no chill, and no illness could shatter the will of those who chose to press on, teeth gritted and axes raised into the very teeth of winter itself. They awoke to the first thaw's mercy, melting drips echoing through the longhouse like reluctant applause. Cracks of daylight stretched across the floorboards, chasing away soot and hungover gloom. But for the men and women who'd returned from frost-ridden raids, the true test lay ahead. Reintegration into warmth without losing their hard-won edge. Part 4 picks up at that delicate moment between survival and resurgence. Breakfast was a communal ritual of absurdity and relief. The cook, ever resourceful, had assembled a healing porridge of barley, goat's milk, and crushed rowan berries, dusted with honey and a pinch of grated ginger. Each spoonful felt like swallowing warmth itself, almost enough to make warriors believe they could shrug off winter entirely. They slurped in near silence, savoring each grain, cheeks flushing as circulation returned to limbs still stiff from frost-soaked bones. One veteran muttered, "If I live through another raid, I swear I'll marry this porridge." With bellies full of near mystical gruel, the chieftain assembled his retinue in the great hall. He raised a carved horn, its rim encrusted with frost-worn runes. To those who endured the bite of winter and lived, may our tales warm future generations. The toast rang like a battle cry turned benediction. Warriors clattered horns and cups against shields, then burst into a rough chorus of the raid song, an off-key cacophony that made even the most hardened smile. Next came the practicalities, rearming and redeploying the frost-scarred ranks. Armor had been stored in smoke-filled vaults to stave off rust. Leather jerkins were hung near the hearth just long enough to ease into pliancy without losing integrity. Weapons, however, demanded more care. Ice crystals had formed in grips and between chain links. Healers soaked them in oil infused with spruce resin, then heated them over coals until steam curled upward. Each swing of a blade afterward sent tiny droplets of amber flickering away, an odd perfume of battle and sawdust. "Sharpen those axes," the chieftain commanded. "If frost lent you tips, hone them back to sin." Warriors filed and whetted blades on whetstones soaked in oil, edges humming like predatory tongues. Shields were inspected for cracks. Any that had split under ice's pressure were bound with fresh leather and retied with sinew. Helmets were buffed until they gleamed, reflecting flickers of torchlight onto soot-stained walls. Meanwhile, scouts returned from perimeter patrols to report on the settlement's defenses. Winter had left gaps in palisades, rotted posts, and frozen mortar and stone walls. Raiders from rival clans may have tested those breaches. Now was the time to repair. Workshops in the yard came alive with the clamor of hammers and the grind of adzes. Carpenters shaped fresh timbers into sturdy beams. Tie ropes were rewoven, and defensive trenches were deepened to channel any future intruders straight into waiting spears. But warriors needed more than wooden fortifications. They required knowledge distilled from Frost's cruelty. Enter the war council of Frost Scouts, those who'd mastered cold weather tactics. They unfurled new battle plans, formations designed to minimize exposure, rotations to keep hands and feet moving, and collective drills for knot tying one-handed. They demonstrated how to pack pouches of heated stones wrapped in wool. "These are our battlefield pocket warmers," one scout declared, audience gasping at the idea of tiny handheld furnaces. The scouts even fashioned small iron flasks with screw-top lids to hold distilled juniper leaf tea, portable heat and antiseptic in one. Illness prevention was next. The healers convened in the hall's corner, laying out their latest tinctures from the cold codex. They brewed rose hip infusions, lemonberry brews, and boiled charcoal in broth to absorb toxins. For each warrior, they portioned doses in carved wooden spoons, instructing, "Take this before dawn's chill, and you'll cough less for every sunrise." A hush fell as the warriors sipped the bitter medicines. For many, it was their first non-mead drink since the raid. Their faces puckered, then relaxed into sheepish grins. "I drink anything that keeps a doctor away." Attention turned to gear upgrades. Sealskin boots, once prized for waterproofing, would be lined with wool fleece and reinforced with rawhide wraps, preventing slush seepage that had doomed many toes. Gloves were redesigned, two-fingered mittens with separate compartments for thumbs, letting archers string bows without exposing sensitive fingers. Leatherworkers demonstrated prototypes, and a chorus of "I'd pay gold for these" issued from Callous Tongue's Bar, a tavern where warriors bragged about their frost scars over clinking steins. Next, the chieftain staged a reenactment of the raid's critical moments, minus the gore. In the courtyard, warriors donned furs and full armor, then simulated scaling palisades with weighted packs, storming through icy water dumps, and forming defensive wedges to repel counterattacks. Younger recruits watched, wide-eyed, as veterans executed maneuvers tested by sorrow and steel. The climax? The heave of heavy baskets of salted pork to the longship's deck. They timed it, 17 seconds for a basket's ascent, 21 seconds for a 3-man lift, benchmarks to beat on future training. Amid drills and toasts, the settlement's bard composed the final verses of the Frost Raid saga. He gathered in the mead hall, quill in hand, translating raw reports into poetic couplets. "When winter's claws reached deep and dark, we hewn our pledge in frozen bark. Our hands went numb, our spirits burned, yet from the frost our will was turned." By nightfall, the completed saga was etched into wooden boards hung above the hearth, a lasting testament to the raid's trials. Each warrior found their name carved among the verses, a promise that their ordeal would be sung by torchlight for generations. The grand conclusion came with a final feast under a sky thick with stars. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, honey cakes, dried fruit compotes, and barrels of spiced mead. A centerpiece stood tall, a gilded horn shaped like an ice dragon, filled to the brim with mulled wine. The chieftain raised it high, to survival not through luck but through resolve, and to the madness that led us to raid in the dead of winter. Laughter roared, echoing against stone walls. Warriors slammed mugs, their breath-warm puffs dancing above rim edges. Children scampered under tables, trying bits of crisp bacon and candied ginger. Elders nodded, preferring pickled herring sting to any sweet. The hall shimmered with candlelight and chorus. As the night deepened, the chieftain slipped away from the revelry to the hall's rear, where a low platform held the Frost Memorial Cairn. He laid down a small blue pumice stone, an odd gift from distant shores, and whispered, "You challenged winter's teeth and lived. May you ever feel its nip in memory, but never in flesh." He poured a final libation of mead over the cairn's top, gin-clear drops tracing runes in the stone. Returning to the feast, he joined his kin in one last chant, an uproarious off-key ditty extolling their frost-scarred valor. It was part prayer, part joke. We drank the frost, we bit the cold, yet here we stand, unbowed, unrolled. By the time the embers died and sleepers sagged in benches, the settlement was wrapped in contented snores. The raid was over, the aftermath commemorated in song, ritual, and rebuilt walls. But for those who'd felt ice redefine their flesh, the lesson endured. Winter was a foe that could be mocked, outwitted, and, if fate was kind, even conquered. In the weeks that followed, the settlement sent envoys to neighboring clans, spreading tales of frost raids and the cures that had saved their people. They traded copies of the Cold Codex, shared tool designs for mittens and ice tongs, and taught frost scout techniques in open-air schools. Soon, the legend of their winter raid became less a solitary triumph and more a turning point in northern warfare, a recognition that when the cold comes howling, humanity's sting can be sharper. And so, as spring's thaw painted rivers silver and meadows bloomed with timid crocuses, the Norse warriors of the Frost Raid looked to the horizon with a cautious eye. They knew raids could erupt in any season, and that the cold would return, but they also carried in their blood a renewed certainty that even Frostbite's cruelty and fever's grasp bowed before human ingenuity, camaraderie, and a well-timed mug of spiced mead. Thus ends Part 4, and with it, the saga of how Norse warriors survived frostbite and illness in winter raids. May their trials warm your hearth fires, chill your spine with wonder, and remind you that the fiercest battles are often fought within.